Welcome back. Tonight, we settle in with the peculiar comfort of 16th century astronomical observation, following the meticulous Danish nobleman Tycho Brahe as he charted the heavens from his island observatory, night after patient night, recording the positions of stars with an accuracy that would not be surpassed for generations. A man who built instruments of brass and oak, who watched the sky with his own eyes long before telescopes existed, and who found, in the slow accumulation of data, a kind of quiet devotion to precision. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these stories help you drift off peacefully. Now, dim the lights. Pull the blanket a little closer. And together, let us ease gently into tonight's story. On the 14th day of December, in the year 1546, in the quiet hours of a Scandinavian winter, a child was born who would one day reshape humanity's understanding of the heavens. Though on that cold morning he was simply another infant arriving into the world, red-faced and small, wrapped against the chill that crept through stone walls despite the fires that servants kept burning in the great hearths. The place of his birth was Knutstorp Castle, a fortified manor house set among the flat, fertile farmlands of Scania, which in those days belonged to the Kingdom of Denmark, though centuries later the shifting borders of nations would place it within the boundaries of Sweden. The child was named Tycho, which in the Latinized form he would later adopt became Tycho, and he entered a family whose bloodlines connected to the highest reaches of Danish power and privilege, a circumstance that would shape nearly every aspect of his remarkable life in ways both obvious and subtle. Knutstorp itself was not a castle in the grand sense that word might conjure to minds filled with images of soaring towers and vast curtain walls, but rather it was what the Danes called a herregård, a manor house befitting a noble family of considerable means and ancient lineage. The structure that stood in 1546 was built of red brick in the style common to Danish aristocratic homes of that era, with stepped gables and a defensive character that spoke to more turbulent centuries past, when the nobility required their homes to serve as refuges against both foreign invaders and domestic rivals. The manor was surrounded by a moat, as was typical of such properties, the still water serving as much for prestige and the practical matter of drainage as for any serious military purpose, though the fortified appearance reminded all who approached that this was the seat of a family accustomed to power and prepared, at least symbolically, to defend it. The lands around Knutstorp stretched outward in the gentle undulations characteristic of Scanian terrain, good agricultural country that had enriched generations of the Brahe family and would continue to do so, the income from tenant farmers and productive fields providing the economic foundation upon which noble status ultimately rested. The father of the newborn child was Art Brahe, a man whose position in Danish society reflected both inherited privilege and personal service to the crown. Art held the role of privy councillor, which placed him among the small circle of nobles who advised the king on matters of state, a position requiring political acumen and demonstrating the trust that the monarch placed in the Brahe family's loyalty and judgment. The Brahes were among the oldest noble families in Denmark, their lineage traceable through centuries of service and intermarriage with other prominent houses, their coat of arms recognized throughout the kingdom as a mark of authentic aristocratic standing. Art was a practical man, concerned with the administration of his estates and the advancement of his family's interests, as was expected of a patriarch in his position, and the birth of a healthy son was an occasion of considerable satisfaction, representing as it did the continuation of the family line and the promise of future alliances through marriage and inheritance. The mother, Beat Bill, brought to the marriage a lineage that was, if anything, even more distinguished than that of her husband, for the Bill family stood among the most powerful and influential in all of Denmark during the 16th century. The Bills had produced generation after generation of men and women who occupied the highest positions the kingdom had to offer, their family tree heavy with bishops who guided the spiritual life of the realm, with statesmen who shaped its policies, with military commanders who defended its borders, and with royal councillors whose advice influenced the course of Danish history. To be born a Bill, or to be born to a Bill mother, was to enter the world with connections and expectations that opened doors which remained firmly closed to those of lesser birth, and young Tycho would benefit throughout his life from the web of relationships that his maternal ancestry provided. Among the notable figures in Beat's family was her father, Claus Bill, who had served as governor of Bohus Fortress, a strategically vital stronghold located on the border between Denmark and Sweden. The position of fortress governor was one of great responsibility and trust, for these fortifications represented the physical manifestation of royal authority in distant regions, and their commanders exercised considerable autonomous power while bearing the weight of accountability for the defense of the realm. Claus Bill had discharged these duties with sufficient competence to maintain the family's reputation, and his granddaughter Beate had been raised with an understanding of both the privileges and obligations that accompanied noble status. The marriage between Art Brahe and Beate Bill was thus a union of two great houses, precisely the sort of strategic alliance that the Danish aristocracy cultivated as a matter of course, strengthening bonds between powerful families and concentrating wealth and influence in ways that would benefit future generations. In the earliest months of young Tycho's life, as he progressed from the helplessness of infancy toward the first tentative awareness of the world around him, the routines of Knutstorp continued in their established patterns. Servants attended to the countless tasks required to maintain a noble household, from the preparation of meals to the care of livestock, from the maintenance of buildings to the management of stores against the long Scandinavian winters. Beate would have supervised the domestic sphere while recovering from childbirth and attending to the needs of her infant son, and Art would have divided his time between the duties of his estates and the obligations of his position at court, which required periodic attendance upon the king and participation in the councils where the business of the realm was conducted. The seasons turned in their unhurried way, spring following winter and summer following spring, and the child grew in the ordinary manner of children, unaware as yet of the extraordinary circumstances that would soon interrupt the expected course of his young life. Among the relatives who took an interest in the newest member of the Brahe family was Art's brother Jørgen, a man whose career had followed a path of distinguished naval service. Jørgen Brahe held the position of vice-admiral of the Danish fleet, a rank of considerable importance in a kingdom whose power and prosperity depended substantially upon control of the seas, particularly the vital waterways of the Øresund Strait through which passed much of the maritime commerce of northern Europe. The Danish navy of this period was a significant force, and those who commanded it wielded real authority, their ships enforcing the king's will across the waters that connected Denmark's scattered territories and protected its interests against rival powers. Jørgen had risen to this position through the combination of noble birth and demonstrated capability that the system of the time required, and he enjoyed both the respect of his peers and the confidence of the crown. Jørgen was married to a woman named Inger Ox, and this marriage, like so many noble marriages of the era, represented a carefully considered alliance between prominent families. The Ox family was itself of great importance in Danish affairs, and Inger's brother, Peter Ox, would in time rise to become Lord High Steward of Denmark, the highest appointed office in the kingdom, a position of such power that its holder stood second only to the king himself in the administration of the realm. Through Inger Ox, Jørgen Brahe was thus connected to a family whose influence would only grow in the coming decades, and any child raised in his household would benefit from these connections as surely as from those provided by the Brahe name itself. There was, however, a source of considerable sorrow in Jørgen and Inger's life together, for their marriage had not produced children. In a society where lineage was paramount and the continuation of family lines was considered among the most important duties of the nobility, childlessness represented both a personal grief and a practical problem of inheritance. Jørgen had wealth and position to pass on, but no heir of his own body to receive them, a situation that led quite naturally to thoughts of alternative arrangements within the extended family. It was apparently understood, or at least Jørgen believed it to be understood, that Art had agreed to allow one of his sons to be raised by Jørgen and Inger, a practice that was by no means unusual in the context of 16th century Danish aristocratic culture. The custom of fostering children among relatives was well established in Denmark and throughout Scandinavia during this period, serving multiple purposes that made sense within the social structures of the time. Noble families were not isolated units but interconnected networks, and the raising of a child by an uncle or aunt strengthened bonds between branches of a family, creating ties of affection and obligation that complemented ties of blood. A child raised in a relative's household would absorb the particular knowledge and connections of that household, would form relationships with its servants and dependents, would become familiar with its estates and the management thereof, and would in time inherit whatever wealth and position that household had to offer. For a childless couple like Jørgen and Inger, The fostering of a nephew provided the emotional satisfaction of parenthood together with the practical benefit of a designated heir who would carry forward their legacy. For the parents who gave up a child to such an arrangement, the compensation came in knowing that their offspring would enjoy advantages and inheritances that could not be provided from their own resources alone, particularly when, as was common, multiple sons had to be provided for from a single estate. When Beat Bill gave birth to a second son, Jürgen saw his opportunity, or perhaps felt that a promise long delayed was finally being fulfilled. The precise nature of what had been agreed between the brothers, if anything formal had been agreed at all, is lost to history, obscured by the passage of centuries and the absence of documentary evidence that might clarify the expectations on either side. What is known is that Jürgen took action that bypassed whatever negotiations or permissions might normally have been required. He simply took the child Tycho from Knutstorp, removing his young nephew from his parents' household without the explicit consent that propriety and family harmony would have demanded. The reaction of Art Brahe to this remarkable presumption was, understandably, one of considerable anger. To have one's firstborn son taken without permission, regardless of any prior understanding or the acceptability of fostering as a general practice, was an affront that touched upon a father's most fundamental rights and feelings. Art threatened legal action against his brother, an indication of just how seriously he viewed the transgression, for to bring such a family dispute before the courts would expose private grievances to public scrutiny and risk lasting damage to relationships and reputations. The law was available as a recourse, and Art made clear his willingness to use it, demanding through whatever formal and informal channels existed that his son be returned. Yet the resolution of this strange episode came not through legal proceedings but through the gradual softening of positions that time and circumstance often bring. Jürgen made formal his intention to name young Tycho as his heir, a commitment that transformed the situation considerably. The child who had been taken would now inherit not only whatever might come to him from his natural father's estate but also the accumulated wealth of Jürgen and Inge's household, including Jürgen's share of the Brahe family properties and whatever additional resources his naval career had allowed him to acquire. Furthermore, the connections that came with Jürgen's position, and particularly the relationship to the increasingly powerful Ox family through Inge, represented advantages that could serve Tycho well throughout his life. Faced with these considerations, Art Brahe relented. The threatened legal action was abandoned, and young Tycho remained with his uncle and aunt, who would raise him as their own son in the years to come. And so the child who had been born at Knutstorp Castle on that December day passed his earliest years in circumstances quite different from those that might have been anticipated at his birth, removed from his natural parents and placed in a household where he was the sole focus of parental attention and affection, where resources that might otherwise have been divided among multiple heirs were concentrated upon him alone, and where connections to naval tradition and to the rising fortunes of the Ox family would shape his opportunities and his worldview. The flat fields of Scania continued their seasonal rhythms beyond the walls of whatever manor housed the young boy, and the stars continued their nightly passage across the Danish sky, as yet unobserved by the child who would one day chart their motions with unprecedented precision. But those observations lay far in the future, and for now there was only a small boy growing up in the care of an uncle and aunt who had wanted him so badly that they had taken him, and parents who had loved him enough to let him go when the advantages of doing so became clear. The circumstances of his early childhood, unconventional though they were, would prove formative in ways that no one could have predicted, setting young Tycho upon a path that led eventually to achievements that outlasted the castles and the noble families and the very kingdom that had produced him. In the year 1553, when Tycho Brahe had reached the age of 7 years, his education began in earnest, as was customary for boys of noble birth in the Kingdom of Denmark during that era. The young child, who had been living with his adoptive parents Jürgen Brahe and Inge Ox at their estate, was sent to receive formal schooling, most likely at a cathedral school in the town of Nykøbing, though the historical records do not preserve with absolute certainty which institution first received him as a pupil. Cathedral schools in 16th century Denmark served as the primary centers of learning for young people destined for careers in the church, in law, or in the service of the crown, and they provided a rigorous foundation in the subjects considered essential for any educated person of that time. The cornerstone of all learning in these schools was the Latin language, which served not merely as a subject of study but as the very medium through which all other knowledge was transmitted and understood. Young Tycho would have spent countless hours learning to read, write, and eventually think in Latin, beginning with simple grammar exercises and gradually progressing to more complex texts drawn from classical authors and religious writings. The importance of Latin in this period cannot be overstated, for it was the universal language of scholarship throughout Europe, the tongue in which philosophers corresponded with one another, in which scientific treatises were composed, and in which the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world had been preserved and transmitted across the centuries. A boy who could not master Latin would find the doors of higher learning firmly closed to him, while one who achieved fluency would have access to the intellectual heritage of Western civilization in its entirety. The days at the cathedral school would have followed a predictable rhythm, with lessons beginning early in the morning and continuing through much of the day, interspersed with prayers and religious observances that formed an integral part of the educational experience. The teaching methods of the time relied heavily upon memorization and recitation, with students expected to commit large portions of text to memory and to demonstrate their learning through oral examination. It was a demanding regimen, though not unusual for its era, and it instilled in those who passed through it a discipline of mind that would serve them well in whatever pursuits they later undertook. Young Tycho, by all accounts, proved himself a capable student, absorbing the lessons presented to him and demonstrating the intellectual curiosity that would later define his life's work. His adoptive uncle Jürgen Brahe harbored clear ambitions for the boy he had taken into his household, and these ambitions centered upon the traditional paths of advancement open to Danish noblemen of the 16th century. Jürgen himself had pursued a career in royal service, eventually rising to positions of considerable responsibility within the administration of the Danish kingdom, and he naturally envisioned a similar trajectory for his adopted son. The study of law and the arts of statecraft seemed the obvious course for a young man of Tycho's birth and position, offering the prospect of influence at court, of diplomatic missions to foreign lands, and of participation in the governance of the realm. These were honorable and respected callings, well suited to a member of one of Denmark's most distinguished noble families, and Jürgen devoted considerable resources to ensuring that Tycho received the education necessary to pursue them. The intellectual climate of Denmark during Tycho's childhood had been profoundly shaped by the religious and educational reforms instituted under King Christian III, who had ruled since 1536 and who had brought the Lutheran Reformation to Danish shores. Under Christian's patronage, the educational system of the kingdom had been reorganized and expanded, with new schools established and existing institutions reformed according to Protestant principles. The University of Copenhagen, which had fallen into decline during the religious upheavals of earlier decades, was revitalized and placed upon a firmer footing, and throughout the realm there was a renewed emphasis upon learning and literacy as essential components of Christian life. The reformers believed that every person should be able to read the scriptures in their own language, and this conviction drove efforts to improve education at all levels of society. Within this environment of intellectual renewal, young Tycho pursued his studies under the watchful guidance of his adoptive family. His aunt Inger Ox, who came from a family known for its learning and cultural refinement, took a particular interest in encouraging the boy's intellectual development, providing him with support and stimulation that complemented the formal education he received at school. The Ox family had produced several notable scholars and administrators, and Inger herself possessed an appreciation for learning that she transmitted to her young charge. Her encouragement would have meant much to a curious child eager to understand the world around him, and her influence helped to create an atmosphere in which intellectual pursuits were valued and nurtured rather than merely tolerated. The years passed in this manner, with Tycho advancing through his Latin studies and preparing himself for the career in law and government that his uncle had planned for him, until an event occurred that would alter the entire course of his life in ways that no one could have anticipated. On the 21st day of August in the year 1559, when Tycho had reached the age of 12 years, a solar eclipse passed over the lands of northern Europe, casting its shadow across the skies and briefly dimming the light of the sun. Solar eclipses had occurred throughout human history, of course, and had been observed and recorded by countless generations before Tycho's time, But what struck the young boy with particular force on this occasion was not merely the spectacle of the eclipse itself, but rather the remarkable fact that it had been predicted in advance. The realization that human beings could know beforehand when the sun would be obscured, that the movements of the heavenly bodies followed patterns regular enough to be calculated and foretold, produced in young Tycho a sense of wonder and astonishment that he would remember for the rest of his days. Here was knowledge of a different order from anything he had encountered in his Latin grammar lessons or his study of law, knowledge that seemed to penetrate to the very structure of the cosmos and to reveal hidden harmonies governing the motions of the celestial spheres. The boy who witnessed that eclipse in August of 1559 was not the same person who had risen that morning expecting an ordinary day, for something had shifted within him. A spark of curiosity had been kindled that would never afterward be extinguished. In the aftermath of this transformative experience, Tycho set about trying to understand how such predictions could be made, seeking out whatever books and instruments might help him penetrate the mysteries of astronomical calculation. He obtained a copy of the Almagest, the great astronomical treatise composed by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century of the Common Era, which remained the authoritative text on the structure of the heavens and the mathematics of celestial motion some 1400 years after its composition. This was a demanding work, written in a technical style and requiring considerable mathematical sophistication to understand fully, but the young Tycho applied himself to it with determination born of genuine passion for the subject. Alongside the Almagest, he acquired Ephemerides, which are tables listing the predicted positions of celestial bodies for each day of the year, allowing him to compare what the calculations foretold with what could actually be observed in the night sky. Among the first astronomical books that Tycho purchased with his own resources was the De Sphæra, a textbook on basic astronomy composed in the 13th century by Johannes de Sacrobosco, whose name was a Latinized form of the English name John of Hollywood. This work had served for centuries as an introductory text for students approaching the study of astronomy for the first time, explaining in relatively accessible terms the spherical nature of the Earth, the arrangement of the celestial spheres surrounding it, and the basic phenomena observable in the heavens. For a 12-year-old boy seeking to understand how eclipses could be predicted, it provided an essential foundation, introducing concepts and terminology that would be necessary for comprehending more advanced works. The De Sphæra was not a work of original research or profound theoretical insight, but it was precisely what a beginner needed, a clear and systematic introduction to a complex field of study. To supplement his reading, Tycho also acquired a small celestial globe, a spherical representation of the heavens showing the positions of the stars and the outlines of the constellations as they appeared from Earth. Such globes were valuable educational tools, allowing students to visualize the arrangement of the celestial sphere and to learn the names and locations of the various constellations that astronomers had identified since ancient times. By rotating the globe and adjusting its orientation, one could simulate the apparent motion of the stars across the sky at different times of night and different seasons of the year, gaining an intuitive understanding of celestial geometry that was difficult to acquire from books alone. The young Tycho spent hours with this instrument, committing to memory the patterns of stars that adorned the heavens and learning to recognize them when he gazed upward on clear nights. This self-directed study of astronomy proceeded alongside the formal education that his uncle Jürgen continued to provide, creating a curious double life for the young nobleman. By day, he pursued his Latin lessons and prepared himself for the career in law and statecraft that his family expected of him, while in his private hours he devoted himself with increasing intensity to understanding the motions of the heavens. The tension between these two paths would persist for many years, as Tycho struggled to reconcile his own passionate interests with the obligations and expectations that came with his position in society. For now, however, he was simply a boy of 12 and then 13, absorbing knowledge wherever he could find it and gradually building the foundation upon which his later achievements would rest. The approach of Tycho's 13th year brought with it preparations for the next stage of his education, for it was customary at that time for promising young noblemen to enter university at what would seem to modern sensibilities a remarkably young age. The universities of the 16th century were different institutions from their modern counterparts, serving in part as advanced schools where adolescents completed their education rather than as places exclusively for mature young adults. A boy of 13 who had demonstrated sufficient mastery of Latin and the other preparatory subjects was considered ready to begin university studies, and Tycho's family began making arrangements for him to enroll at the University of Copenhagen, where he would continue his education under the guidance of learned professors and in the company of other young men from noble and scholarly families. As these preparations went forward, the young Tycho carried with him the memory of that August day when the sun had darkened according to prediction, and he carried too the questions that experience had awakened within him. How could human beings know such things? How could they calculate in advance the movements of bodies so vast and so distant? And what did this knowledge reveal about the nature of the universe in which we find ourselves? These were questions that would occupy him for decades to come, drawing him ever deeper into the study of the heavens and eventually making him the most accomplished observational astronomer the world had yet seen. But all of that lay in the future, unknown and unguessable, as the young boy of 13 prepared to leave his childhood behind and to embark upon the next stage of his remarkable journey through life. On the 19th of April in the year 1559, a boy of 12 years arrived at the University of Copenhagen to begin his formal education, as was the custom among families of noble standing in the Danish realm. This was not considered particularly young for such an undertaking, for the sons of aristocracy were expected to enter university at ages that might seem rather early to modern sensibilities, and Tycho Brahe, having spent the preceding years under the careful guardianship of his uncle Jürgen, was deemed sufficiently prepared in Latin and the foundational subjects to take his place among the other young scholars. The university at Copenhagen was a modest institution in those days, having been established less than a century prior, and it served primarily to prepare young men of good family for careers in government, the church, or the law, which were the respectable paths that society had laid out for those born into privilege and responsibility. The curriculum that awaited young Tycho had been determined not by his own inclinations but by the practical ambitions of his uncle, who envisioned for his adopted son a distinguished career in service to the crown, perhaps as a diplomat or a councillor of state, the sort of position that required facility with rhetoric, a grounding in philosophy, and above all a thorough understanding of the law. And so Tycho found himself attending lectures on these subjects, sitting in the cool stone halls where professors expounded upon the works of Aristotle and Cicero, where the intricacies of legal precedent were unfolded with careful deliberation, and where young minds were shaped according to the expectations of their station. For a boy of 12, the days would have been structured and full, moving from lecture to study to the various rituals of university life, and by all outward appearances, Tycho was progressing along the path that had been chosen for him. Yet something else had begun to stir in his mind during these Copenhagen years, a quiet fascination that would gradually grow until it eclipsed all other pursuits. It is difficult to say precisely when the interest first took hold, whether it was sparked by a particular lecture touching upon natural philosophy, or by some chance observation of the night sky, or perhaps by the acquisition of a book that opened windows onto the celestial realm. What we do know is that during his time at Copenhagen, Tycho became aware of the great questions that astronomers had pondered for centuries: the movements of the planets against the fixed stars, the geometry of the heavens, and the challenge of predicting where celestial bodies would appear on any given night. These were matters far removed from the rhetoric and law that his uncle wished him to master, and yet they called to him with an insistence that he could not easily ignore. In February of 1562, when Tycho was 15 years old, a new chapter of his education began with his departure for the University of Leipzig, which lay in the German lands of Saxony and was considered a more distinguished institution for the advanced study of law. He did not travel alone, for his uncle had arranged for him to be accompanied by a tutor named Anders Wedel, a young man of 20 who was himself a promising scholar with particular interests in history and literature. Wedel's task was straightforward in principle if challenging in practice: to keep his young charge focused upon the legal studies that would prepare him for his intended career, and to ensure that the considerable expense of a foreign education would yield the proper returns. The two young men, tutor and student separated by only a few years in age, set out together on the journey southward through the winter landscape, crossing the waters and then the German territories until they reached Leipzig, where they would remain for the next several years. Leipzig presented Tycho with opportunities that Copenhagen had not, for it was a larger city with a more extensive university, and crucially, It was home to scholars whose interests touched upon mathematics and the sciences of the heavens. Yet officially, Tycho was there to study law, and Wedel took his supervisory duties seriously, monitoring his charged attendance at lectures and his progress in the required subjects. What Wedel did not immediately realize was that Tycho had begun to lead something of a double life, outwardly compliant with the expectations placed upon him while secretly pursuing the astronomical studies that had captured his imagination. With the allowance provided by his uncle, Tycho began to acquire books on astronomy and mathematics, works that he kept hidden from his tutor and studied in the hours when he was supposed to be resting or reviewing his legal texts. Among the instruments that Tycho purchased during these Leipzig years was a cross-staff, a simple but ingenious device used for measuring the angular distances between celestial objects. It consisted of a long wooden staff with a shorter crosspiece that could slide along its length, and by sighting along the staff while adjusting the crosspiece, an observer could determine the angle between two stars or between a star and the horizon. Such instruments had been used by astronomers and navigators for generations, and while the cross-staff was far from the most sophisticated tool available, it represented for Tycho an essential first step into practical observation. He acquired this instrument secretly, along with others, hiding them in his quarters and bringing them out at night when Wedel was asleep and the skies were clear enough for observation. The relationship between Tycho and his tutor during these years seems to have been one of quiet tension, with Wedel growing increasingly frustrated by his charged nocturnal activities and apparent lack of dedication to the law, while Tycho became ever more absorbed in his astronomical pursuits. Wedel would later write of this period with a mixture of exasperation and grudging admiration, acknowledging that despite his best efforts, he had been unable to redirect Tycho's energies toward more practical ends. The young nobleman would sit through his legal lectures during the day, perhaps absorbing enough to satisfy the minimum requirements, but his true education was taking place in the hours after midnight, when he stood in courtyards or leaned from windows, his cross-staff in hand, carefully noting the positions of stars and planets against the dark canopy of the sky. It was during his time in Leipzig that Tycho made his first recorded astronomical observation, documenting with care the positions of celestial bodies and the times at which he observed them. This marked the beginning of a practice that would define his entire scientific career, the systematic recording of data in notebooks that he maintained with extraordinary diligence. Unlike many observers before him who had made occasional measurements and rough estimates, Tycho understood from the very start that the value of observations lay in their precision and their accumulation over time. He developed methods for recording not only what he saw but the conditions under which he saw it, the instruments he used, the state of the atmosphere, and any factors that might affect the accuracy of his measurements. These early notebooks, begun in Leipzig when he was still a teenager, established patterns of documentation that he would refine and follow for the rest of his life. The event that crystallized Tycho's sense of purpose and transformed his amateur interest into a consuming mission occurred on the 24th of August in the year 1563, when he was 16 years old. On that night, the planets Jupiter and Saturn came together in the sky in what astronomers call a great conjunction, an event that occurs roughly once every 20 years when the two largest planets, as seen from Earth, appear to pass very close to one another. Such conjunctions had been observed and recorded for millennia, and they held particular significance for astrologers who believed that they heralded important events in human affairs. For Tycho, the conjunction presented an opportunity to test the accuracy of the astronomical tables then in use, which predicted when and where such events should occur. What he discovered that August night would shape the entire course of his subsequent career. When he compared his own careful observations of the conjunction with the predictions contained in the standard astronomical tables, he found that the tables were wrong, and not by small amounts but by days. The Alfonsini tables, which were based upon the ancient Earth-centered system of Ptolemy and had been the standard reference for European astronomers for centuries, predicted the conjunction incorrectly. But equally troubling, the newer Prutenic tables, which were based upon the heliocentric theory of Copernicus and had been published only a dozen years earlier, also failed to predict the conjunction accurately. Both systems, the old and the new, the geocentric and the heliocentric, gave predictions that did not match what Tycho could see with his own eyes in the actual sky above Leipzig. This discrepancy struck the young observer with the force of revelation. If neither the ancient authorities nor the modern reformers could accurately predict something as fundamental as when two planets would appear together, then something was deeply wrong with the foundations of astronomical knowledge. The problem, Tycho realized, was not primarily one of theory but of data. Both Ptolemy and Copernicus had built their systems upon observations that were centuries old, measurements made with crude instruments under uncertain conditions, passed down through generations of copying and recopying with all the errors that such transmission entailed. What astronomy needed, what it desperately required before any theoretical questions could be properly addressed, was a new foundation of accurate observations made with precise instruments and recorded with meticulous care. And in that moment of recognition, standing perhaps in some Leipzig courtyard with his simple cross-staff, the teenage Tycho understood what his life's work would be. During his years in Leipzig, Tycho also had the good fortune to encounter scholars who could nurture his growing interests and teach him skills that formal instruction had not provided. Among the most important of these was Bartholomew Schultz, a mathematician of some local reputation who recognized the young Dane's unusual abilities and took him under his guidance. From Schultz and others, Tycho learned the mathematical techniques necessary for astronomical calculation, the geometry of triangles and circles that underlay the prediction of planetary positions, and the methods by which raw observations could be transformed into useful tables and ephemerides. These were technical skills that required patience and precision, the careful working through of lengthy calculations, and Tycho proved himself an apt and dedicated student. It was also during the Leipzig period that Tycho began to think seriously about the design and construction of astronomical instruments, recognizing that the tools available to him were inadequate for the precision he desired. The cross-staff he had purchased was useful for learning the basic techniques of observation, but its accuracy was limited by the difficulty of aligning it properly and by the inherent imprecision of sighting along a wooden rod. Tycho began to conceive of instruments that would be larger, more stable, and capable of measuring angles to fractions of a degree that existing devices could not reliably attain. He made sketches and calculations, considering how different designs might reduce the sources of error that plagued astronomical measurement, and he began to construct simple instruments of his own, testing his ideas and learning through trial what worked and what did not. The notebooks from these early years reveal a mind that was already remarkable in its combination of theoretical understanding and practical attention to detail. Tycho recorded not only his observations but his thoughts about how to improve them, noting when atmospheric conditions made measurement difficult, when his instruments seemed to give inconsistent results, and how he might address these problems in future. He was learning, through direct experience, the many ways in which error could creep into astronomical data, from the limitations of instruments to the fallibility of human senses to the tricks that the atmosphere could play on light passing through it. Each source of error that he identified became a problem to be solved, and over time he would develop techniques and instruments designed to minimize or eliminate them. By the time his years in Leipzig drew toward their close, Tycho Brahe had been transformed from a noble youth with a passing interest in the stars into a dedicated astronomer with a clear sense of mission. The Great Conjunction of 1563 had shown him that the astronomical knowledge of his age rested on foundations of sand, and he had resolved to build something more solid. His secret studies, conducted in defiance of his tutor and in contradiction of his family's plans for his career, had given him the basic skills of observation and calculation, and his early efforts at instrument design had shown him both what was possible and what remained to be achieved. The boy who had arrived in Copenhagen to study rhetoric and law had discovered his true calling, and though many years of work lay ahead before his ambitions would be realized, the essential direction of his life had been set during these formative years in the university cities of Denmark and Germany. In the year 1565, when Tycho Brahe was still a young man of 18 years, a tragedy befell his family that would alter the course of his circumstances considerably, and this event, though sorrowful, would provide him with the financial independence that allowed his astronomical pursuits to flourish in the years that followed. His uncle Jürgen Brahe, the man who had raised him since infancy and provided for his education with such care and attention, met his end in a manner that the chronicles of the time describe as both heroic and unfortunate, for it was said that Jürgen had rescued King Frederick II of Denmark from drowning, an act of loyalty and bravery that cost him dearly. The circumstances surrounding this rescue remain somewhat unclear in the historical record, as is often the case with events that occurred so many centuries ago, but the accounts generally agree that Jürgen Brahe contracted pneumonia as a result of his exertions in the water, and that this illness proved fatal, claiming his life on the 21st day of June in that same year. Whether the king had fallen from a bridge or a boat, and whether Jürgen had plunged into cold waters to retrieve him, are details that vary from one telling to another, but what remains certain is that Tycho's foster father died, and in dying, left his nephew a considerable inheritance that would shape the trajectory of his scientific endeavors. This inheritance was substantial indeed, comprising lands and wealth sufficient to allow a young nobleman to pursue his interests without the immediate necessity of securing patronage or employment, and Tycho, who had already demonstrated his passion for the study of the heavens, found himself in possession of the means to continue his education across the universities of Europe. The loss of his uncle must have weighed upon him, for Jürgen had been more of a father to him than his biological father Art Brahe had been in many respects, and yet the practical consequence of this bereavement was a newfound freedom, both financial and personal, that Tycho would employ in the service of his astronomical observations and his broader philosophical investigations into the nature of the cosmos. And so it was that in the year 1566, Tycho Brahe departed once again from Denmark and made his way to the German lands, where the universities offered instruction in the mathematical and astronomical sciences that he so eagerly wished to master. His first destination was the University at Wittenberg, a city of considerable importance in the intellectual and religious history of Europe, for it was there that Martin Luther had famously posted his theses some decades earlier, and the university retained a reputation for serious scholarly inquiry. Tycho enrolled at Wittenberg and commenced his studies, though his time there would be cut short by circumstances entirely beyond his control, for in the summer of that year, the plague descended upon the city, as it so often did in those centuries when epidemic disease could sweep through European towns with devastating regularity. The plague was a familiar terror in the 16th century, and those who had the means to flee from an afflicted city generally did so without hesitation, understanding that remaining in a place where the sickness had taken hold was to court death with a recklessness that bordered on folly. Tycho, possessing both the financial resources and the good sense to remove himself from danger, departed Wittenberg and travelled northward to the city of Rostock, where he hoped to continue his studies in relative safety. Rostock was a Hanseatic city on the Baltic coast, home to a university that had been established in the early 15th century, and Tycho settled there to resume his academic pursuits, far from the pestilence that had driven him from Wittenberg. He continued his studies of mathematics and astronomy, corresponding with other scholars and refining his understanding of the celestial motions, and by all accounts his time at Rostock was productive and intellectually rewarding. However, it was also at Rostock that an incident occurred which would mark Tycho Brahe for the remainder of his life, leaving him with a distinctive physical feature that became inseparable from his public identity and his legend in the centuries that followed. This incident was a duel, fought in the waning days of December in 1566, and its consequences were both immediate and permanent. The duel took place on the 29th of December, at or following a Christmas celebration hosted by one of the professors at the university, and Tycho's opponent was a fellow Danish nobleman by the name of Manderup Parsberg. The two young men were of similar social standing, both members of the Danish aristocracy studying abroad, and the cause of their quarrel has been reported in various ways by different sources, though the most commonly cited explanation involves a dispute over a mathematical question. It may seem remarkable to us now that two noblemen would draw swords over a matter of mathematics, but we must remember that intellectual disputes in the 16th century were often conducted with a passion and a sense of personal honor that could easily escalate into physical confrontation, and that young aristocrats were trained from childhood in the use of weapons and the defense of their reputations. Whether the disagreement concerned a specific calculation, or a point of astrological interpretation, or some broader question of mathematical principle, the historical record does not specify with certainty, but what is clear is that Tycho and Parsberg found their disagreement sufficiently serious to settle it with steel. The duel itself was brief, as such encounters often were, and its outcome was grievous for Tycho Brahe, for in the course of the fighting he received a wound to his face that severed the bridge of his nose. The blade, whether wielded with deliberate aim or striking by chance in the confusion of combat, removed a portion of cartilage and flesh that could not be restored, leaving Tycho with a disfigurement that he would carry for the rest of his days. Such injuries were not uncommon in an age when dueling was a regular feature of aristocratic life, and many a gentleman bore scars from youthful encounters that testified to disputes long since forgotten. But the loss of the nasal bridge was a particularly visible and striking wound, and Tycho was obliged to devise a solution that would restore some semblance of normal appearance to his face. The solution he devised was a prosthetic nose, crafted from metal and worn over the damaged area to conceal the disfigurement and present a more conventional profile to the world. For centuries, the traditional account held that this prosthetic was fashioned from an alloy of gold and silver, precious metals befitting a man of noble birth and considerable wealth, and this romantic detail became one of the most famous aspects of Tycho Brahe's biography, repeated in countless books and articles about his life and work. However, when Tycho's tomb was opened and his remains were examined by researchers in the year 2010, chemical analysis of residues found on his skull revealed a somewhat different picture, for the traces of metal detected were consistent with brass and contained copper rather than the precious metals of legend. It appears, then, that Tycho's prosthetic nose was made of brass, perhaps with a thin coating or overlay of more valuable metal for appearance, or perhaps the golden nose was reserved for special occasions while a more practical brass version served for everyday use. Whatever the precise composition, Tycho carried with him a small container of paste or adhesive that he used to affix the prosthetic to his face, and he became so accustomed to wearing it that his contemporaries rarely remarked upon the device once the initial novelty had faded. The duel with Parsberg, despite its violent nature, did not result in lasting enmity between the two men, and later records suggest that Tycho and Manderup eventually reconciled and maintained a cordial relationship in subsequent years. Such was often the way with aristocratic disputes in that era, where honor demanded satisfaction but did not necessarily require permanent hostility, and where former adversaries might find themselves allied by marriage, politics, or shared interests in the fullness of time. Tycho recovered from his wound and continued his studies at Rostock, his passion for astronomy undimmed by the physical reminder of that December night, and his reputation as a serious student of the heavens continued to grow among those who shared his interests. During these years of travel and study, Tycho Brahe developed an interest in alchemy and the medical theories associated with the Swiss physician Paracelsus, whose ideas were gaining considerable attention in learned circles across Europe. Paracelsian medicine represented a departure from the traditional Galenic system that had dominated European medical thought for centuries, proposing instead an approach rooted in chemical processes and the transformation of substances, and its practitioners sought to understand the body and its ailments through the lens of alchemical principles. Tycho found these ideas compelling, perhaps because of the connection between alchemical theory and the broader understanding of nature that he sought through his astronomical observations, for both disciplines promised insight into the hidden workings of the cosmos and the fundamental substances from which all things were composed. He studied the preparation of medicines and the transmutation of materials, setting up small laboratories where he could conduct experiments with metals, salts, and other substances, and this interest in alchemy and Paracelsian medicine remained with him throughout his life, running parallel to his more celebrated work in observational astronomy. After his time at Rostock, Tycho continued his travels and eventually made his way to the city of Basel, where he pursued further studies and continued to expand his network of correspondents and collaborators. The universities of the German-speaking lands offered rich opportunities for a young man of intellectual curiosity and financial means, and Tycho took full advantage of these opportunities, absorbing knowledge from professors and fellow students alike while refining his own ideas about the structure of the heavens and the proper methods for observing celestial phenomena. He was particularly interested in the design and construction of astronomical instruments, understanding that the accuracy of any observation depended critically upon the quality of the tools employed, and he began to formulate plans for instruments of unprecedented size and precision that would allow him to measure the positions of stars and planets with greater exactitude than any observer before him. In the year 1569, Tycho's travels brought him to the city of Augsburg, a prosperous and culturally vibrant city in the southern German lands, and it was there that he met a man whose friendship would prove both congenial and productive for his astronomical ambitions. This man was Paul Haensel, a mathematician, and patron of the sciences who possessed both the intellectual appreciation for Tycho's work and the financial resources to support ambitious projects. The two men found common ground in their passion for precise astronomical measurement, and together they conceived a plan to construct an instrument of remarkable scale, a great quadrant that would dwarf anything previously built for the purpose of celestial observation. The quadrant they designed had a radius of approximately 19 feet, a truly enormous device that required substantial engineering skill to construct and a permanent mounting to support its weight and maintain its stability. Such an instrument could not be moved from place to place but had to be installed in a fixed location where it would remain as a monument to serious astronomical inquiry, and Heinzel offered his estate as the site for this great quadrant, providing both the land and the funding necessary to bring the project to fruition. The construction of this instrument was a significant undertaking, requiring the work of skilled craftsmen and the careful calibration of its graduated scale, and when it was completed, it stood as one of the largest astronomical instruments in Europe, capable of measuring the altitudes of celestial bodies with a precision that smaller devices could not approach. Although this particular quadrant would eventually be destroyed by a storm some years later, its construction represented an important step in Tycho's development as an instrument maker and observer, demonstrating his commitment to the principle that accurate astronomy required instruments built to the highest possible standards of size and precision. Throughout these years of travel and study, Tycho maintained connections with his family in Denmark, though his relationship with his biological father Art Brahe appears to have remained somewhat distant compared to the bond he had shared with his foster father Jørgen. Art Brahe was a man of the traditional Danish nobility, more concerned with matters of estate management and political influence than with the astronomical and alchemical pursuits that occupied his son's attention, and there is little evidence of close collaboration or deep understanding between father and son during these years. Nevertheless, when Art Brahe died on the 9th of May in 1571, the event brought Tycho home to Denmark once again, for there were matters of inheritance and family obligation that required his presence, and the responsibilities of a nobleman could not be entirely neglected even by one whose heart lay among the stars. And so Tycho Brahe, now 24 years of age, returned to the land of his birth, bearing with him the knowledge and experience he had accumulated during his years of wandering through the universities and cities of Europe, his prosthetic nose a permanent reminder of a youthful quarrel, his mind filled with plans for instruments and observations that would revolutionize the understanding of the heavens. The death of his father marked the end of one chapter in his life and the beginning of another, as he took up his place among the Danish nobility while continuing to pursue the astronomical work that had become his consuming passion. The years ahead would bring discoveries and opportunities beyond anything he could have imagined, but for now, he was simply a young man come home to mourn his father and to contemplate the path that lay before him. And so we come now to a quiet November evening in the year 1572, when Tycho Brahe was 25 years old and staying at the home of his uncle Steen Bill, a man who shared Tycho's curiosity about the natural world and who had established an alchemical laboratory at Heravad Abbey, a former monastery situated in the countryside of Scania, which was then part of Denmark though it would later become Swedish territory. The abbey was a peaceful place, given over to scholarly pursuits and the slow, methodical work of alchemy, which in those days was not merely the pursuit of turning base metals into gold, but rather a broader investigation into the fundamental nature of matter and transformation. Tycho had been spending time there, working alongside his uncle, learning the techniques of the alchemical laboratory, though his heart remained always with the stars above. On the 11th of November, as the sun had set and the darkness of the autumn evening had settled over the land, Tycho was walking from his uncle's laboratory back toward the main buildings of the abbey. The air would have been cold, as it tends to be in Denmark in November, and the sky was clear, which is something of a gift in that part of the world where clouds so often obscure the heavens. Tycho, being the sort of person who could not help but look upward whenever the stars were visible, glanced toward the familiar pattern of Cassiopeia, that constellation shaped rather like the letter W, which sits in the northern sky and wheels around the pole star throughout the year. And there, in a place where no star had ever been before, he saw something extraordinary. A new star had appeared in the heavens, shining with a brightness that exceeded even Venus at her most brilliant, and Tycho stopped there in the cold November darkness and simply stared. He could scarcely believe what he was seeing, for according to everything that natural philosophy had taught for nearly 2,000 years, such a thing was impossible. The celestial sphere, that realm above the moon where the stars and planets dwelt, was supposed to be perfect and unchanging, composed of a substance called the quintessence or ether, which was fundamentally different from the four elements that made up everything beneath the moon. Stars did not simply appear where there had been none before. And yet here was a star, undeniably present, burning with a fierce white light in the constellation of Cassiopeia. Tycho's first instinct was to confirm that he was not deceived, and so he asked the servants at the abbey to look at the sky and tell him what they saw, and they too could see the brilliant new point of light, which reassured him that this was not some trick of his own eyes or some fleeting atmospheric phenomenon. Over the following nights and weeks and months, Tycho devoted himself to the careful observation of this stellar nova, as he would come to call it, using the astronomical instruments he had designed and built himself, including a sextant of remarkable precision that allowed him to measure the angular distances between celestial objects with an accuracy that few others in Europe could match. The crucial question that Tycho set out to answer was whether this new star exhibited any parallax, which is the apparent shift in position of a nearby object when viewed from different angles or at different times. If you hold your finger up in front of your face and close first one eye and then the other, you will see your finger appear to jump against the background, and this is parallax. The moon, being relatively close to the Earth, shows a measurable parallax over the course of a single night as the rotation of the Earth carries the observer from one side to the other, effectively giving them different viewing angles. If this new star were located below the moon, perhaps in the upper atmosphere or in the region of fire that Aristotelian physics placed above the air, then it too should show parallax as it was observed throughout the night from different positions. Tycho measured the position of the new star with painstaking care, night after night, comparing its location relative to the fixed stars of Cassiopeia, and he found that it showed no parallax whatsoever. It remained in exactly the same position relative to the other stars, no matter what time of night he observed it, no matter what season of the year. This could only mean one thing, that the new star was located not in the atmosphere or in some region close to Earth, but out in the celestial sphere itself, among the fixed stars. It was genuinely new, a change in the heavens that Aristotle and all his followers had declared to be impossible. This was a discovery of profound importance, though Tycho approached it with the same methodical care that he brought to all his work. He continued observing the star throughout 1572 and into 1573, noting how its brightness gradually diminished over time, fading from its initial brilliance until it eventually disappeared from view entirely in 1574. He recorded his observations with meticulous precision, and then he sat down to write a book about what he had seen and what it meant. The book was called De Nova Stella, which means simply on the new star, and it was published in Copenhagen in 1573. In this modest volume, Tycho presented his observations, his measurements, his calculations regarding parallax, and his conclusions about the location and nature of the star. He coined the term nova to describe this phenomenon, a word that simply means new in Latin, and though we now know that what Tycho observed was actually what astronomers call a supernova, the catastrophic explosion of a distant star, the term nova remains in use to this day for certain types of stellar outbursts. It is a small linguistic gift from Tycho to the future, this word that he invented to describe something that the old cosmology had no name for because it was not supposed to exist. De Nova Stella made Tycho famous throughout the learned world of Europe. Here was a young Danish nobleman who had not only observed a remarkable celestial event but had proven, through careful measurement and rigorous reasoning, that it occurred in a place where such things were supposed to be impossible. The book was discussed in universities and courts across the continent, and Tycho's name became known to scholars and princes alike. It was the beginning of his reputation as the foremost astronomer of his age, though much work remained to be done before that reputation would be fully established. During this same period of his life, sometime around 1573, Tycho entered into a relationship with a woman named Kirsten Jorgensdatter, though she is sometimes called Christine in historical sources. She was a commoner, the daughter of a Lutheran minister from a village near Knudstrup, and this presented a significant social complication for a man of Tycho's noble standing. In Denmark at that time, the laws governing marriage between nobles and commoners were strict, and a formal marriage between Tycho and Kirsten was not possible without Tycho sacrificing his noble status and all the privileges that came with it. Instead, they entered into what was known as a morganatic union or common law marriage, an arrangement that was recognized socially if not legally, and which allowed them to live together as husband and wife in all but the strictest formal sense. Kirsten would remain with Tycho for the rest of his life, a partnership that lasted nearly 30 years, and she bore him 8 children, though not all of them survived to adulthood, which was sadly common in that era. The children of such unions occupied a complicated social position, being acknowledged by their father but not entitled to inherit his noble title or estates. Nevertheless, by all accounts, the household that Tycho and Kirsten created together was a stable and affectionate one, and Kirsten was a capable manager of the domestic side of the complex establishments that Tycho would later create. She was, in many ways, the quiet center around which the storms of Tycho's ambitious scientific projects would swirl. Tycho's growing fame brought him to the attention of King Frederick II of Denmark, who recognized that here was a subject of exceptional talent who might bring honor to the Danish crown. In 1574, the king requested that Tycho deliver a series of lectures on astronomy at the University of Copenhagen, which was an unusual distinction for a nobleman, since teaching was generally considered beneath the dignity of the aristocratic class. Tycho agreed, however, and delivered his lectures to an audience that included students, scholars, and curious members of the court. The lectures covered the fundamentals of astronomy as it was then understood, with particular attention to the recent appearance of the new star and what it might mean for our understanding of the cosmos. These lectures were well received, and they served to cement Tycho's position as a figure of intellectual importance within Denmark. The king began to consider how he might encourage Tycho to remain in his native country rather than accepting one of the invitations that had begun to arrive from foreign princes eager to have such a distinguished astronomer at their courts. This royal interest would eventually bear fruit in a remarkable way, but that development lay a few years in the future still. In the meantime, Tycho continued his observations and his thinking about the structure of the heavens. The appearance of the new star had shown that the celestial sphere was not the unchanging realm of perfection that Aristotelian philosophy had described, and this opened up questions about what else might be wrong with the traditional picture of the cosmos. Tycho did not immediately reject the entire Aristotelian framework, for he was a cautious thinker who preferred to base his conclusions on observation rather than speculation, but he began to consider the possibility that significant revisions might be necessary. His opportunity to explore these questions further came in 1577, when a great comet appeared in the skies over Europe. Comets had long been considered atmospheric phenomena, disturbances in the upper air that had nothing to do with the celestial sphere, and they were often regarded as omens of disaster or upheaval in human affairs. But Tycho, applying the same techniques he had used to study the nova, set out to determine the true location of the comet through careful measurements of its parallax. What he found confirmed his growing suspicion that the traditional cosmology was fundamentally flawed. The comet, like the nova before it, showed no measurable parallax, which meant that it too was located beyond the moon, out in the celestial sphere among the planets and stars. This was deeply problematic for the old model of the cosmos, which held that the planets were carried around the Earth on solid crystalline spheres nested one inside another. If the comet was moving through the celestial regions, as Tycho's observations indicated, then it would have to pass through these crystalline spheres, which ought to be impossible if the spheres were solid objects. Tycho began to suspect that the crystalline spheres did not exist, that the planets moved through empty space or perhaps through some subtle fluid that offered no resistance to their motion. This was a radical idea, though Tycho approached it with his characteristic caution, gathering evidence and making measurements rather than rushing to publish bold theoretical claims. The full development of his ideas about the structure of the cosmos would take several more years, and would eventually result in his famous Tychonic system, a compromise between the old Earth-centered model and the new Sun-centered model that Copernicus had proposed. But all of that lay in the future. For now, in the years between 1572 and 1576, Tycho was a young man whose life was taking shape in ways that would determine his future course. He had made a discovery that brought him fame throughout Europe. He had found a partner who would share his life and bear his children. He had attracted the attention and favor of his king, and he had begun to develop the observational techniques and the questioning habits of mind that would eventually revolutionize our understanding of the heavens. The new star in Cassiopeia was the beginning of all this, a point of light that appeared when no light had been before, challenging everything that the learned world thought it knew about the nature of the cosmos, and setting in motion a series of events that would eventually help to bring about the scientific revolution that transformed the modern world. But those great transformations were still far off, and for now we may simply rest with the image of a young man standing in the cold November darkness outside his uncle's abbey, looking up at an impossible star, and beginning the work that would occupy the rest of his life. On the 18th day of February in the year 1576, the young Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe received what would become one of the most extraordinary royal gifts in the history of science, a present so lavish and so perfectly suited to its recipient that it would shape the course of astronomical observation for more than 2 decades to come. King Frederick II of Denmark, recognizing the rare talents of this nobleman who had forsaken the usual pursuits of his class in favor of measuring the positions of stars, granted to Tycho the entire island of Fyn, a modest stretch of land roughly 3 miles in length, situated in the cold grey waters of the Øresund Strait between Denmark and Sweden. Along with the island itself came something perhaps even more valuable, the promise of substantial royal funding to construct an observatory, a place where Tycho might pursue his celestial investigations without the distractions and limitations that had troubled his work in the years before. The king understood, in his own way, that what Tycho required was not merely encouragement or patronage in the ordinary sense, but rather a complete environment dedicated to the patient and exacting work of watching the heavens. The island of Fyn was home to a small population of farming families who worked the land and fished the surrounding waters, and while it was not a grand territory by any measure of political importance, it possessed certain qualities that made it ideal for Tycho's purposes. The relatively flat terrain offered unobstructed views of the horizon in all directions, the elevation sufficient to lift one's instruments above the worst of the atmospheric disturbances that plagued observations taken at sea level, and the isolation from the mainland provided a quietness and freedom from the comings and goings that might otherwise interrupt the long nights of careful measurement. Here, Tycho could build not merely a house or a workshop, but an entire institution devoted to understanding the machinery of the cosmos, a place where the movements of planets and stars could be tracked with a precision that had never before been attempted, let alone achieved. The plans that Tycho drew up for his new observatory reflected both his scientific ambitions and his considerable sense of grandeur, for he was after all a nobleman accustomed to certain standards of living, and he saw no reason why the pursuit of knowledge should require uncomfortable or mean surroundings. He named his creation Uraniborg, which translates from the Latin as the Castle of Urania, Urania being the muse of astronomy in the classical tradition, she who inspired mortals to lift their gaze from earthly matters and contemplate the eternal dance of celestial bodies. The name itself suggests something of Tycho's vision, a fortress dedicated not to warfare but to wisdom, a palace whose towers reach toward the stars not as a gesture of human pride but as instruments of patient inquiry. Ground was broken for the construction of Uraniborg on the 8th day of August in 1576, and Tycho, ever attentive to the influence of the heavens upon earthly affairs, took considerable care to ensure that the cornerstone was laid at an astrologically favorable moment. This was no contradiction in his mind, no tension between the rigorous empiricism of his astronomical work and the more speculative art of astrology, for in the 16th century these two disciplines were closely intertwined, and most educated people believed that the positions of planets and stars at particular moments carried genuine significance for events below. Tycho himself cast horoscopes and interpreted celestial omens throughout his life, and so it seemed only natural that the foundation of his great observatory should be blessed by an auspicious arrangement of the heavens at the moment of its beginning. The architecture of Uraniborg drew upon the Renaissance ideals of proportion, symmetry, and classical elegance that were then spreading across Europe from their origins in Italy. The main building featured a central tower that rose above the surrounding structure, providing elevated platforms for observation, and at each of the 4 corners stood smaller towers capped with distinctive onion-shaped domes that gave the building a silhouette unlike anything else in Denmark at that time. These domes were not merely decorative, for they serve practical purposes in protecting the delicate instruments from rain and wind when not in use, and their rounded shapes allowed for mechanisms that could rotate sections of the roof or remove panels entirely, permitting the observers within to direct their instruments at any portion of the sky without having to move outside into the cold Danish nights. The ability to observe from within a sheltered space, while still having an unobstructed view of the heavens, represented a significant advance in the comfort and therefore the accuracy of astronomical work, for an observer shivering in the wind cannot hold a sighting instrument as steadily as one who is protected from the elements. Within the walls of Uraniborg, Tycho incorporated amenities that were remarkably advanced for their time, demonstrating both his practical ingenuity and his appreciation for civilized living. The building featured running water supplied through a system of pipes and pumps, a convenience that most European homes would not enjoy for centuries to come, and even more remarkably, it included flushing toilets, those devices that we now take entirely for granted but which in the 1570s were extraordinary luxuries found only in the most sophisticated households. The water system required careful engineering to maintain pressure and flow, and its construction speaks to the level of technical sophistication that characterized Tycho's approach to every aspect of his work, whether measuring the position of Mars or ensuring that his household enjoyed modern comforts. The grounds surrounding the main building were laid out with geometric precision, the gardens arranged in symmetrical patterns that reflected the same mathematical sensibility that governed Tycho's astronomical calculations. Pathways radiated outward from the central structure, flower beds were organized according to careful proportions, and the overall effect was one of order imposed upon nature, a terrestrial echo of the celestial order that Tycho spent his nights attempting to understand. Within this compound, he established a paper mill to produce the large quantities of high-quality paper needed for recording observations and publishing results, and a printing press that would allow him to produce books and pamphlets without relying on printers in distant cities who might introduce errors or delays. These facilities gave Uraniborg a self-sufficiency that few other scholarly establishments could claim, turning it into something like a small university or research institute centuries before such institutions became common. Beneath the main building, in the cellar spaces where the temperature remained relatively constant throughout the year, Tycho constructed an elaborate chemical laboratory equipped with alchemical furnaces and distillation apparatus for pursuing his investigations into the transformation of matter. This work, which we might today call chemistry but which in Tycho's time was still intertwined with the mystical traditions of alchemy, occupied a considerable portion of his attention alongside his astronomical observations. He prepared medicines and remedies using techniques and recipes that combined practical pharmaceutical knowledge with more speculative theories about the correspondences between celestial and earthly substances, and among the products of his laboratory were treatments for various ailments that afflicted the peasant population of Van. When plague threatened the island, as it periodically did throughout this era, Tycho distributed his remedies to the farming families under his authority, an act that combined genuine concern for their welfare with the feudal obligations of a landlord to his tenants. One of the most impressive instruments at Uraniborg was the Great Mural Quadrant, an enormous measuring device built directly into a south-facing wall of the observatory. This instrument consisted of a brass arc, graduated with extraordinary precision, attached permanently to the masonry of the building itself, with sighting devices that allowed observers to measure the altitude of celestial bodies as they crossed the meridian, that imaginary line running from north to south through the highest point of the sky. By building the quadrant into the structure of the building rather than mounting it on a separate stand, Tycho ensured a stability and rigidity that portable instruments could never achieve, and the resulting measurements attained a level of accuracy that astonished the astronomical community of Europe. The wall itself became part of the instrument, its massive weight providing an immovable reference against which the smallest movements of stars and planets could be detected. To operate this great enterprise required a substantial staff, and over the years Uraniborg became home to a fluctuating population of assistants, students, craftsmen, and servants who together formed a kind of research community devoted to the study of the heavens. Young men came from across Europe to learn the techniques of precise observation under Tycho's demanding supervision, and some of them would go on to distinguished careers of their own, carrying the methods they had learned on Fen to other parts of the continent. Skilled artisans worked in the workshops, fabricating and maintaining the delicate instruments upon which all the observations depended, their metalworking and optical skills essential to achieving the accuracy that set Tycho's measurements apart from all that had come before. The household included cooks and cleaners, gardeners, and gatekeepers, and all the other workers necessary to maintain a noble establishment in that era. For Uraniborg was not merely a scientific institution but also a manor house where the proprietor lived in considerable style. The cost of constructing and operating this remarkable establishment was enormous by any standard of the time, consuming resources that represented perhaps 1% of the entire state budget of Denmark over the years of its construction and early operation. This figure gives some sense of the extraordinary commitment that King Frederick made to supporting Tycho's work, an investment in pure research that had no obvious practical application but which the king nonetheless considered worthwhile. The relationship between royal patron and scientific investigator was not always smooth, for Tycho could be difficult and demanding, and there were times when the flow of funds slowed or stopped entirely, but for more than 2 decades the essential support continued, allowing the work at Uraniborg to proceed with a continuity and scale that would have been impossible under ordinary circumstances. The observatory buildings themselves were designed with observation in mind from the very beginning, featuring rotating roofs and removable panels that could be opened to reveal any portion of the sky that the observers wished to examine. These mechanical systems, operated by ropes and pulleys and counterweights, allowed the astronomers to adapt their workspace to the particular requirements of each night's observations, tracking objects across the heavens as they rose and set, following planets through their slow migrations against the background of fixed stars. The engineering required to make these systems work reliably in the harsh Baltic climate, where rain and ice and wind could damage delicate mechanisms, represented yet another triumph of practical ingenuity in service of scientific inquiry. As the years passed and the work at Uraniborg matured, the island of Fven became known throughout the learned world as a center of astronomical excellence, a place where the most accurate measurements of celestial positions were being accumulated night after patient night. Visitors came from many countries to see the instruments and meet the man who had built them, and Tycho's reputation grew to the point where he was acknowledged as the foremost observational astronomer of his age. The combination of resources that King Frederick had provided, the island with its unobstructed horizons, the funding for instruments and staff, the freedom to pursue investigations without distraction, had created conditions uniquely suited to the kind of careful, systematic observation that would eventually transform humanity's understanding of the cosmos. Here on this small island in the cold northern sea, in a castle dedicated to the muse of the stars, the groundwork was being laid for discoveries that would outlast the buildings themselves, the instruments that made them, and the remarkable man who had designed them all. By the year 1581, Tycho Brahe had already established himself as one of the most careful observers of the heavens that Europe had ever known, and his castle observatory at Uraniborg had become a place of pilgrimage for scholars and nobles alike, a destination where the serious work of measuring the positions of stars was carried out with a dedication that bordered on the devotional. Yet for all the grandeur of Uraniborg, with its towers rising above the flat landscape of the island of Fven, Tycho had begun to notice a problem that troubled him deeply, a difficulty that arose not from any fault in his instruments or in the skill of his assistants, but rather from the very structure of the building itself and from the invisible movements of the air that surrounded it on every side. The towers of Uraniborg, you see, were exposed to the winds that swept across the Orson Strait, those steady breezes that came in from the sea and pressed against the stone walls and caused the entire structure to vibrate, ever so slightly, in ways that were imperceptible to ordinary sensation but which revealed themselves with troubling clarity when one attempted to make observations of the finest precision. A tower that seemed perfectly solid to the touch might nonetheless tremble by a fraction of a degree when the wind blew strongly, and this trembling, invisible though it was, introduced errors into the measurements that Tycho found intolerable. For a man who sought to know the positions of the stars to within a single minute of arc, even the gentlest swaying of his observing platform was a source of frustration, and he began to consider what might be done to eliminate this difficulty altogether. The solution he arrived at was characteristically thorough and somewhat unusual. Rather than attempting to strengthen the towers or to devise some mechanism for dampening their vibrations, Tycho decided that he would build an entirely new observatory, one that would be sunk into the ground itself, so that its instruments would rest upon the solid bedrock of the island and would be sheltered from the wind by the earth that surrounded them on every side. This new facility would be called Stjernborg, which may be translated as Star Castle, though it was not a castle in any conventional sense, having no towers and no walls rising above the surface of the ground, but rather a series of subterranean chambers arranged in a careful pattern, each one designed to house a particular instrument and to provide the conditions of absolute stability that serious astronomical work required. The construction of Stjernborg began in 1581 and continued over the following years, the workers digging into the soil of fen to create 5 principal chambers, each one circular or polygonal in plan, each one roofed with a dome that could be removed or rotated to expose the instrument within to the open sky. From a distance, Stjernborg presented an unusual appearance, for one saw only a series of low structures rising barely above the level of the ground, their domes visible as gentle curves against the flat horizon, while the true working spaces lay hidden below, carved out of the earth and lined with masonry to keep them dry and secure. The instruments themselves were positioned so that their sighting devices stood at ground level, just high enough to clear the surrounding terrain, while the observer and the mechanisms that supported the instrument remained below, protected from the wind and steadied by the immovable foundation of the island itself. This arrangement proved to be remarkably effective. The great instruments of Stjernborg showed none of the troublesome vibration that had plagued those mounted in the towers of Uraniborg, and Tycho found that he could now make observations of a consistency and precision that had previously eluded him. The underground chambers remained at a relatively stable temperature as well, which helped to preserve the accuracy of the graduated scales engraved upon the instruments, since metal and wood alike will expand and contract with changes in warmth, introducing errors that must be accounted for if one wishes to achieve the highest accuracy. Among the instruments installed at Stjernborg, the most celebrated was the Great Mural Quadrant, an enormous device constructed against the south-facing wall of one of the chambers, with a radius of some 6 feet, or roughly 2 meters in more modern terminology, its graduated arc allowing Tycho to measure the altitude of celestial objects as they crossed the meridian with an accuracy that no previous astronomer had approached. The quadrant was mounted directly upon the wall, which was itself aligned precisely north and south, so that when a star or planet passed across the meridian, Tycho could read off its altitude from the carefully engraved scale and record the observation in his logbooks with confidence that the measurement was as accurate as human skill and careful craftsmanship could make it. The wall behind the quadrant was decorated with a painted scene showing Tycho himself at work in his observatory, surrounded by assistants and instruments, a visual record of the enterprise that has survived in various copies and which gives us a sense of how the great astronomer wished to be remembered. In addition to the mural quadrant, Stjernborg housed an azimuth quadrant designed for measuring the horizontal positions of celestial objects, an equatorial armillary sphere whose rings were aligned with the celestial equator rather than the horizon, and a revolving wooden quadrant mounted upon a vertical axis so that it could be turned to face any direction in the sky. Each of these instruments was constructed with the utmost care, using techniques that Tycho himself had developed or refined over many years of practice, and each one was equipped with sighting mechanisms and graduated scales that represented the very highest achievement of 16th century craftsmanship. One of the innovations that Tycho employed in the construction of his instruments was the use of transversal dots for subdividing the scales beyond the smallest divisions that could be physically engraved. The principle was straightforward but ingenious. By arranging a series of dots in a diagonal pattern across the width of each scale division, one could estimate fractions of a division by observing which dot aligned most closely with the pointer or sighting line, thereby reading off measurements to a precision several times finer than the spacing of the engraved marks themselves. This technique, which Tycho may have learned from earlier sources or may have developed independently, allowed him to squeeze every possible degree of accuracy from his instruments, and it was one of the reasons why his observations achieved a level of precision that would not be surpassed until the invention of the telescope some decades later. The accuracy of Tycho's instruments and methods is generally estimated at approximately 1 arcminute, which is to say 1/60th of a degree, or about 1/30th the apparent diameter of the full moon as seen from the Earth. This may not sound particularly impressive to modern ears, accustomed as we are to measurements of extraordinary precision in every field of science, but in the context of 16th century astronomy it represented an improvement of perhaps 5 or 10 times over the best observations that had been made previously, and it was this improvement that would eventually make possible the great theoretical advances of the following century. When Johannes Kepler later used Tycho's observations to derive his laws of planetary motion, it was precisely this unprecedented accuracy that allowed him to detect the elliptical shape of planetary orbits, a deviation from circular motion so small that it would have been invisible in less precise data. To maintain this level of accuracy required not only fine instruments but also careful procedures, and Tycho developed a system of observation that was as methodical and disciplined as any modern scientific protocol. On clear nights, he and his assistants would take up their positions at the various instruments, each person assigned a specific role, whether as observer, recorder, or timekeeper, and they would work through the hours of darkness in a coordinated routine that allowed them to capture as many observations as possible while the sky remained clear. The observations were recorded in detailed logbooks, with entries noting the date, the time, the instrument used, the celestial object observed, and the measured position, along with any remarks about the conditions of observation or the quality of the data obtained. At its peak, Tycho's establishment employed as many as 30 assistants, some of them students who came to learn the art of astronomy, others skilled craftsmen who helped to build and maintain the instruments, and still others who served in various supporting roles, from preparing meals to copying manuscripts. Among this company was Tycho's younger sister, Sophie Brahe, who possessed a talent for observation and calculation that equaled that of many professional astronomers of the time, and who contributed to the work of the observatory over a period of several years. Sophie was also known as a genealogist of considerable skill, and her interests ranged across many fields of learning, though it is her astronomical work that is remembered most fondly by those who study the history of science. Tycho maintained an extensive correspondence with astronomers and scholars across Europe, exchanging observations, discussing theoretical questions, and keeping abreast of the latest developments in the field. This network of correspondence was an important part of the scientific enterprise of the time, serving some of the same functions that journals and conferences serve today, and Tycho was diligent in cultivating relationships with those who shared his interests. To support this correspondence and to disseminate his work more broadly, he established a printing press at Uraniborg, one of the first private printing establishments in Scandinavia, and from this press he issued a series of publications that included annual star catalogues, records of his observations, and treatises on astronomical topics. Among the most important of Tycho's publications was his account of the comet of 1577, a celestial visitor that appeared in the skies of Europe during the autumn of that year and which attracted the attention of observers across the continent. Tycho made careful measurements of the comet's position over a period of several weeks, recording its location against the background of fixed stars and noting how it moved from night to night as it traced its path through the heavens. When he came to analyze these observations, he attempted to determine the comet's distance from the Earth by measuring its parallax, which is to say the apparent shift in its position when viewed from different locations on the Earth's surface. The result of this analysis, which Tycho published in 1588 in a substantial treatise, was that the comet showed no detectable parallax, or at least none greater than that of the Moon, which meant that it must be located far beyond the Moon's orbit, out among the planets or even beyond. This was a finding of considerable significance, for it contradicted the prevailing Aristotelian view that comets were atmospheric phenomena, exhalations rising from the Earth that caught fire in the upper regions of the air, and it suggested instead that comets were genuine celestial bodies moving through the heavens at enormous distances from the Earth. The implications of this conclusion were far-reaching, for if comets could move through the celestial regions, then the crystalline spheres that were supposed to carry the planets in their orbits could not be solid and impenetrable, as traditional cosmology maintained, but must be either non-existent or at least permeable to the passage of such wandering bodies. This growing evidence against the traditional cosmology led Tycho to develop his own system of the world, a model that attempted to reconcile the observations with a modified version of the Earth-centered universe. In the Tychonic system, as it came to be called, the Earth remained stationary at the center of the cosmos, with the Sun and Moon orbiting around it, but the other planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, were held to orbit not the Earth but the Sun, so that the Sun carried them along as it made its annual circuit of the heavens. This arrangement produced much the same apparent motions as the sun-centered system proposed by Copernicus, but it avoided the philosophical and theological difficulties that many scholars saw in the idea of a moving Earth, and it appealed to those who wished to accept the mathematical advantages of the Copernican model without committing themselves to its more radical implications. The Tychonic system never achieved the lasting influence of either the Ptolemaic or the Copernican models, being eventually superseded by the acceptance of a heliocentric universe, but it served as an important intermediate step in the transformation of cosmological thought, and it demonstrated the seriousness with which Tycho approached the theoretical as well as the observational aspects of his science. For Tycho, the careful accumulation of accurate observations was always the foundation upon which any sound theory must be built, and he devoted himself to this task with a patience and thoroughness that set an example for all who came after him. And so the years passed at Venn, with Tycho and his assistants keeping their nightly vigils, recording the positions of stars and planets with ever greater precision, publishing their findings for the benefit of the learned world, and contributing to the slow but steady progress of astronomical knowledge. The underground chambers of Stjernborg, sheltered from the wind and resting upon the solid rock of the island, provided the stable foundation that this work required, and the great instruments that filled them represented the highest achievement of pre-telescopic astronomy, monuments to human ingenuity and to the patient determination of one remarkable observer who wished, above all else, to know the true arrangement of the heavens. In the year 1588, while the island of Venn continued its quiet rhythms of observation and calculation, Tycho Brahe committed to paper a vision of the heavens that sought to reconcile the ancient wisdom of Ptolemy with the mathematical elegance that Copernicus had proposed some decades before. This work, bearing the lengthy Latin title De Mundi Aetherae Recensuribus Phenomenis, which we might render in English as something like On Recent Phenomena in the Celestial World, contained within its pages a cosmological system that Tycho believed answered the most pressing questions of his age while avoiding the difficulties that had troubled both the old astronomy and the new. The system that Tycho proposed was neither purely Ptolemaic nor purely Copernican, but rather something that borrowed from each tradition while departing from both in significant ways. At the center of Tycho's universe sat the Earth, motionless and steady, just as our ordinary senses might suggest it to be when we stand upon its surface and feel no rushing wind, no perpetual eastward motion, nothing to indicate that we are hurtling through space at tremendous velocities. Around this stationary Earth, in Tycho's arrangement, the moon traced its familiar monthly path, waxing and waning as it circled our world just as the ancients had always believed. And the sun, too, in Tycho's system, revolved around the Earth, completing its circuit once each year and bringing with it the steady progression of the seasons that farmers and sailors had relied upon since time beyond memory. But here the similarity to the Ptolemaic system ended, for Tycho made a bold departure that set his cosmology apart from anything that had come before. The 5 planets known to the astronomers of his day, those wandering stars called Mercury and Venus, Mars, and Jupiter and Saturn, did not in Tycho's system revolve around the Earth at all. Instead, these 5 celestial bodies traced their paths around the sun, accompanying that bright orb on its annual journey while simultaneously circling it in their own particular periods. The result was a kind of cosmic dance in which the sun served as a secondary center, carrying with it a retinue of planets that orbited not the Earth directly but rather the sun itself, even as the sun and its planetary companions all revolved together around our central world. This arrangement, which later scholars would come to call the geo-heliocentric system or sometimes simply the Tychonic system, possessed certain advantages that recommended it to careful thinkers of the late 16th century. For those who found the Ptolemaic system too cumbersome, with its intricate nesting of circles upon circles, the Tychonic model offered something of the mathematical simplicity that Copernicus had achieved by placing the sun at the center. The retrograde motions of the planets, those puzzling episodes when Mars or Jupiter seems to reverse its direction against the background of fixed stars, emerged naturally from Tycho's system without requiring the elaborate epicycles that Ptolemy had employed. In this respect, Tycho's cosmology shared the elegance of the Copernican approach. Yet for those who could not accept the notion of a moving Earth, who found it philosophically troubling or physically implausible that our massive world should be rushing through space without any sensible effect upon the objects and creatures dwelling upon its surface, the Tychonic system offered reassurance. The Earth remained where common experience suggested it should be, fixed and central, the stable platform from which we observe the turning heavens. Tycho was well aware of the objections that had been raised against the Copernican theory, The arguments from physics which asked why, if the Earth truly rotated on its axis once each day, we do not feel a constant wind blowing from the east, why objects drop from towers fall straight down rather than being left behind by a spinning world, why the birds and the clouds are not swept away by our planet's motion. These were serious concerns in an age before the physics of inertia had been properly understood, and Tycho's system elegantly avoided them all by keeping the Earth precisely where tradition had always placed it. The publication of this cosmological treatise marked an important moment in Tycho's career as a natural philosopher, but the work of observing and cataloguing continued on the island of Fenn just as it had in years past. The great instruments that Tycho had designed and constructed, the mural quadrant fixed to its meridian wall, the armillary spheres and sextants of unprecedented size, all these continued their patient work of measuring the positions of stars and planets night after clear night. And as the years passed, as observation accumulated upon observation and measurement refined measurement, the star catalogue that Tycho was compiling grew steadily in both scope and precision. The project of mapping the fixed stars was not new to Tycho, for he had been gathering positional data since his earliest years as a serious observer. But the instruments at Uraniborg and later at Stjernborg, instruments far superior to anything that had existed before, allowed Tycho to achieve a level of accuracy that would have seemed scarcely possible to earlier generations of astronomers. Where Ptolemy's ancient catalogue, inherited and refined by Arabic astronomers over the centuries, gave stellar positions accurate perhaps to 10 or 15 minutes of arc, Tycho aimed for something far more demanding. With his great mural quadrant he could determine positions to within 2 or 3 minutes of arc, and sometimes better still, a precision perhaps 4 or 5 times greater than anything previously achieved. The catalogue grew slowly, as such careful work must always proceed, and over the years it would eventually encompass very nearly 1,000 stars, each one assigned a position on the celestial sphere with the greatest exactitude that Tycho's instruments and methods could provide. This work of stellar cartography was in many ways less glamorous than the study of comets or the proposal of new cosmological systems, but it was precisely the sort of patient, meticulous labor that would prove invaluable to later astronomers seeking to understand the motions of the heavens. A reliable framework of fixed stars, mapped with precision and care, provided the reference points against which all other celestial motions could be measured and compared. Among those who assisted Tycho in this exacting work was a young man from the Danish countryside named Christian Svensson, who would later become known to the learned world by his Latinized name, Longomontanus. He arrived at the island of Fenn in 1589, drawn like so many others by Tycho's growing reputation and by the opportunity to learn astronomy under the foremost practitioner of the age. Longomontanus was of humble origins, the son of a farmer, and his path to education had not been easy, but he possessed both mathematical ability and the patient temperament that the work at Uraniborg demanded. For 8 years Longomontanus labored at Fenn, from 1589 until 1597, and during this time he became one of Tycho's most capable and trusted assistants. The work was demanding, requiring long nights of careful observation followed by equally careful calculation, but Longomontanus proved well suited to these tasks. He assisted with the compilation of the star catalogue, he helped to reduce and analyze the ever-growing collection of planetary observations, and he learned from Tycho not only the technical methods of astronomical measurement, but also the philosophical approach that insisted on grounding all theoretical speculation in the solid foundation of reliable data. The years that Longomontanus spent at Uraniborg would shape his entire subsequent career, and he would remain throughout his life a defender of Tycho's cosmological system against the competing claims of Copernican astronomy. Yet even as the astronomical work at Fenn continued to flourish, clouds were gathering over Tycho's enterprise, clouds of a political and personal nature that would eventually force the great astronomer to abandon the island he had made famous throughout learned Europe. The death of King Frederick II in 1588 had removed Tycho's most reliable patron and protector, and the new king, Christian IV, was only 11 years old at the time of his father's death. The kingdom was governed by a council of regents during the young king's minority, and these regents proved considerably less sympathetic to Tycho and his expensive astronomical establishment than Frederick had been. Part of the difficulty lay in Tycho's own character, for the great astronomer had never been an easy man with whom to deal. His noble birth and his consciousness of his own extraordinary achievements had combined to produce a personality that many found arrogant and difficult. He expected deference from those he considered his inferiors, and he was not always gracious even toward those of equal or higher station. On the island of Fenn, where Tycho exercised considerable authority over the local peasants as a condition of his feudal grant, his behavior had at times been harsh in ways that went beyond what the law permitted. There were complaints that Tycho had employed illegal forms of punishment, including the use of stocks and imprisonment, against peasants who had displeased him or who had failed in their obligations to the estate. Such treatment bred resentment among those who suffered it, and the complaints eventually reached the ears of those who were not well disposed toward the astronomer. As the 1590s progressed, Tycho found himself increasingly at odds with the regents and with elements of the Danish nobility. His enemies at court seized upon every opportunity to diminish his standing, and Tycho's own behavior provided them with ample material. He neglected certain obligations that came with his various grants and incomes, including the maintenance of a royal chapel that had been placed under his care. Such neglect, whether due to absorption in his astronomical work or to simple inattention to matters he considered beneath his notice, gave his critics grounds for complaint and suggested that Tycho was not the reliable steward of royal resources that a man of his position ought to be. When the young King Christian IV came of age in 1596 and assumed personal rule of the kingdom, the situation deteriorated further still. Christian was not inclined to continue the generous support that his father had provided to the astronomical establishment at Venn. The new king reduced Tycho's funding, cutting away at the income that had sustained Uraniborg and its elaborate programs of observation and publication. The Norwegian fief income that Tycho had relied upon was confiscated, and with it went a substantial portion of the resources that had made his work possible. Tycho appears to have alienated the young king personally, perhaps through that same aristocratic hauteur that had made him enemies among the nobility. The business of the neglected royal chapel did not help matters, for it suggested a man who was willing to take the king's money while ignoring the responsibilities that came with it. Christian IV was a proud young monarch, not yet 20 years old but already conscious of his royal dignity, and he was not the sort to tolerate being taken for granted by an aging astronomer, however famous that astronomer might be throughout learned Europe. By 1597, Tycho's position in Denmark had become untenable. The funding continued to diminish, the political hostility continued to grow, and it became clear that there was no longer a secure place for Tycho and his great enterprise within the Danish kingdom. The departure of Longomontanus in that same year, after 8 productive years of collaboration, was perhaps a sign of the troubles that were closing in. The golden age of Fenn was drawing to its end, and Tycho would soon be forced to seek a new patron and a new home for his instruments and his ambitions, leaving behind the island where he had accomplished so much but where he was no longer welcome. On the 29th of March, in the year 1597, Tycho Brahe departed from the island of Fenn, the small patch of land in the Oresund Strait that had been his home and his kingdom of stars for more than 2 decades, and though he could not have known with complete certainty at that moment, he would never return to walk its grounds again, never again climb the steps of Uraniborg or peer through the great mural quadrant that had measured the heavens with such unprecedented precision for so many quiet years. The departure was not sudden in its causes, for the tensions between Tycho and the Danish crown had been building slowly, like clouds gathering on a distant horizon, through disagreements over funding and obligations, through the cooling of royal favor that had once burned so warmly under Frederick II, but had grown considerably dimmer under the young King Christian IV, who perhaps did not share his predecessor's enthusiasm for the expensive enterprise of mapping the sky. And so Tycho made the decision that many scholars before him had made and many would make after, to seek more hospitable conditions elsewhere, to carry his life's work to a place where it might be properly valued and continued. The logistics of such a departure were considerable, for Tycho was not the sort of man who traveled lightly, and his years on Fenn had accumulated not merely personal possessions but an entire apparatus of scientific inquiry that existed nowhere else in the world. His instruments, those magnificent constructions of brass and iron and careful calibration, had to be dismantled and packed with the utmost care, for they represented not just material value but decades of refinement and adjustment, each one tuned to a precision that could not easily be replicated. The great celestial globe, nearly 5 feet in diameter and marked with the positions of stars he had himself observed, was among the treasures that accompanied him, along with sextants and quadrants and armillary spheres and all the other tools of his particular trade. He brought also his printing press, that essential instrument for disseminating knowledge, which had produced so many volumes on the island and would continue its work in the years to come. For Tycho understood that observations locked away in private notebooks served astronomy far less than observations shared with the learned world. His records came with him as well, those precious logs of measurements taken night after night over so many years, the raw material from which the new astronomy would eventually be constructed, though Tycho himself would not live to see that construction completed. The household that departed Hven was substantial, comprising not only Tycho himself but his wife Kirsten, whom he had married in a morganatic union many years before, and their 6 surviving children, along with assistants and servants and all the various persons necessary to maintain both a noble household and a functioning observatory. It was, in essence, a small village in motion, a traveling community dedicated to the study of the heavens, uprooting itself from the only fixed position it had known and setting out into an uncertain future with nothing but the hope that somewhere, a patron would recognize the value of what Tycho had built and what he still hoped to accomplish. The party made its way first to Copenhagen, the Danish capital, where they stayed briefly while arrangements were made for the longer journey ahead. It must have been a strange interlude, this pause in the city that had once celebrated Tycho's accomplishments and granted him the island kingdom where he had done his greatest work, now serving merely as a way station for a departure that must have felt, in some ways, like an exile. But Tycho was not a man given to excessive sentiment when there was practical work to be done, and by June of 1597, he and his entire household had left Denmark entirely, crossing into the German lands where he hoped to find the support that his homeland had withdrawn. The first significant stop on this wandering journey was Rostock, a port city on the Baltic coast, where Tycho had connections from his earlier years, for it was in Rostock that he had lost part of his nose in that famous duel during his student days. And though that might seem an inauspicious association, the city offered a temporary haven while longer-term plans were considered. From Rostock, the traveling household made its way to Wandsbek Castle, located near the prosperous city of Hamburg, where Tycho became the guest of Heinrich Rantzau, a Danish nobleman and scholar who had himself an interest in astronomy and the intellectual pursuits that Tycho represented. Rantzau was the sort of educated aristocrat who delighted in hosting learned men, and his castle provided Tycho with both the physical space and the social connections necessary to begin the process of finding a new permanent patron. It was during this period of residence at Wandsbek that Tycho undertook a project that would prove enormously important for spreading knowledge of his work and, not incidentally, for attracting the attention of potential patrons who might offer him a new home for his observatory. He prepared and published, in 1598, a remarkable volume titled Astronomy and Storia Mechanica, which might be translated as Instruments of the Restored Astronomy, and which contained detailed descriptions and beautiful engravings of the various instruments he had designed and constructed over his decades of work. This was not merely a catalogue of equipment but a statement of methodology, a demonstration to the learned world that Tycho's astronomical achievements rested upon a foundation of unprecedented instrumental precision, that his measurements of stellar and planetary positions could be trusted because the tools that produced them had been designed with extraordinary care and built to tolerances that no previous astronomer had achieved. The engravings in this volume are themselves works of art, detailed illustrations showing each instrument in its full complexity, with human figures included for scale and to demonstrate the methods of operation, and these images served both to document Tycho's technical achievements and to impress upon readers, particularly readers who might be in a position to offer patronage, the sophistication and expense of the enterprise that Tycho had established and hoped to continue. He sent copies of this beautifully produced book to various rulers and nobles across Europe, essentially advertising his availability and his qualifications, and among the recipients was the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who resided in Prague and who would eventually become the patron that Tycho sought. Alongside this mechanical treatise, Tycho was also preparing for publication another crucial work, the Astronomie and Storia Progymnasmata, or Preliminary Exercises for the Restored Astronomy, which contained a portion of his star catalogue and his observations of celestial phenomena, including the famous new star of 1572. This work would not be fully published during Tycho's lifetime, but the sections that he prepared and circulated during these wandering years further established his reputation and his claims to be the foremost observational astronomer in Europe, a man whose services any serious patron of science would be fortunate to secure. The household at Wandsbek maintained something of the character it had possessed on Hven, for Tycho was not merely a scholar but a nobleman who kept an establishment appropriate to his rank, and this establishment included various curiosities and entertainments that were common among the wealthy and learned of that era. Among the more memorable residents of Tycho's household was an elk, or moose as it might be called in some regions, which lived in the castle and wandered about with a certain domesticated freedom that such animals do not typically possess. This creature became something of a local celebrity and was mentioned in Tycho's correspondence with other natural philosophers and noble patrons, including the Landgrave Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, who was himself an enthusiastic astronomer and with whom Tycho maintained a long and scientifically productive exchange of letters. The fate of this elk is recorded in that same correspondence, and it serves as a small and somewhat melancholy footnote to this period of wandering, for the animal met its end through an accident that combines the mundane and the absurd in a manner that seems almost too colourful to be true, yet is documented in Tycho's own letters. The elk, it seems, had been sent to visit a nobleman in the area, perhaps as a gift or perhaps merely as a curiosity to be displayed at some gathering, and at this nobleman's residence, the creature gained access to beer and consumed a considerable quantity of the beverage, more than was wise for an animal not accustomed to such refreshment. Having become intoxicated, the elk then attempted to navigate a staircase and, losing its footing in that impaired condition, tumbled down the stairs and sustained injuries from which it did not recover. It is a strange little story, this tale of the beer-drinking elk dying on the stairs, but it speaks to the character of Tycho's household, which was not merely a place of serious scientific work but also a small court of curiosities and wonders, where the boundaries between the scholarly and the entertaining were not always strictly maintained. The family that travelled with Tycho through these uncertain years comprised his wife Kirsten and their 6 children who had survived to that point, for infant mortality was common in that era and Tycho's family had known its share of such sorrows. Kirsten, whose maiden name was Barbara, though she was commonly called by the Danish form Kirsten, had been Tycho's companion for many years, though their marriage had been somewhat irregular by the standards of the Danish nobility, for she was of common birth and their union was therefore considered morganatic, meaning that while it was legally valid, it did not confer noble status upon her or their children. This had caused Tycho various difficulties in Denmark, where questions of status and inheritance were taken very seriously, but in the wandering years and the new life that would follow, such distinctions perhaps mattered less than the simple fact of their long partnership and shared life. The invitation that Tycho had been hoping for arrived eventually, as the copies of his books and the letters of inquiry he had sent to various courts bore fruit, and it came from perhaps the most prestigious source possible, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who summoned Tycho to Prague and offered him the position and the resources he needed to continue his work. Rudolf was a peculiar ruler, more interested in art and learning and strange collections of natural curiosities than in the practical business of governance, and his court at Prague was filled with alchemists and artists and scholars of every description, a haven for exactly the sort of enterprise that Tycho represented. The invitation was welcome and Tycho accepted, setting out once more with his household and his instruments for the journey to Bohemia. The route took the travelling party through various German territories, including stops at Dresden and Wittenberg, cities of learning and culture where Tycho was received with the respect due to his reputation, and where he could add to the network of correspondents and supporters that any scholar of that era needed to maintain. The journey itself was a considerable undertaking, for the entourage that Tycho led was not a simple family travelling from one residence to another, but something more like a portable observatory, a scientific household in motion, complete with the instruments and records and printing equipment and personnel necessary to conduct astronomical research. When Tycho arrived somewhere, it was not merely a man arriving but an institution, and the work of observation and calculation and publication could resume almost immediately, provided the conditions were suitable. This period of wandering, From a departure from Vennes in 1597 to the eventual settlement in Prague and later at the castle of Banatky nad Jizeru in 1599, represents a transitional phase in Tycho's life, a time of uncertainty in travel but also of continued productivity and, ultimately, of success in securing the patronage he sought. The publications produced during this period spread knowledge of his methods and instruments throughout learned Europe. The correspondence he maintained kept him connected to the broader community of astronomers and natural philosophers, and the invitation from Rudolf II opened a final chapter of his career that would include the hiring of a young German mathematician named Johannes Kepler, whose work with Tycho's data would eventually transform astronomy in ways that Tycho himself could not have fully anticipated. And so the wandering years came to their close, as all periods of transition eventually must, with Tycho established in a new home under a new patron, ready to continue the work that had occupied his life since those early observations made in his youth, when he first noticed that the predicted positions of the planets did not match their actual locations in the sky and resolved to do something about that discrepancy. In the summer of the year 1599, Tycho Brahe arrived at last in the city of Prague, having journeyed southward from the lands of his earlier exile, carrying with him the accumulated work of decades and the quiet hope that he might find, in this new place, the stability and patronage that would allow him to complete the great astronomical projects he had begun so many years before on his island of Fehn. The city that greeted him was unlike any he had known in Denmark or in the German territories through which he had passed, for Prague under the rule of Emperor Rudolf II had become a place of unusual character, a gathering point for scholars and artists and practitioners of obscure sciences, all drawn by the emperor's well-known fascination with the mysteries of the natural world and his willingness to support those who pursued such mysteries with dedication and skill. Tycho's audience with the emperor took place at Radkany Castle, that great complex of buildings perched upon the hill overlooking the Vltava River, where Rudolf had established his court and filled the chambers with paintings and curiosities and the instruments of alchemical experimentation. The meeting between the aging astronomer and the reclusive emperor was, by all accounts, a formal affair, conducted with the ceremony appropriate to such occasions, and it resulted in an appointment that must have brought Tycho considerable relief after the uncertainties of recent years. He was named Imperial Mathematician, a title of genuine distinction, and he was granted an annual salary of 3,000 florins, a sum substantial enough to support his household and his scientific work, along with a residence where he might establish his instruments and continue his observations of the heavens. The residence initially provided to Tycho was Banatky nad Jizeru, a castle situated some 35 kilometers from Prague itself, in the gentle countryside of Bohemia where the land rolls quietly toward the river and the nights, when clear, offer views of the sky unobstructed by the smoke and light of the city. Here Tycho began the work of setting up his observatory once more, unpacking the instruments that had traveled with him from Fehn and arranging the spaces where his assistants might carry out the calculations and recordings that were so essential to his method. Yet the distance from Prague proved inconvenient for a man who needed access to the imperial court, who required the materials and communications that only a major city could provide, and who perhaps also felt the pull of being nearer to the center of intellectual activity that Rudolf's patronage had created. And so, in June of the year 1600, Tycho moved his household and his operations to a location closer to the city, taking up residence in what was known as the Curtius House, a property that offered the advantages of proximity to Prague while still providing the space necessary for astronomical work. It was here, in this more urban setting, that Tycho would spend the final portion of his life, continuing the observations and calculations that had occupied him for so many years, while also navigating the complex relationships that characterized the court of Rudolf II and the community of scholars who had gathered there. The court of Rudolf was, it must be said, a peculiar environment, one in which the boundaries between what we might now call science and what was then understood as magic or occult philosophy were not clearly drawn. The emperor himself was a man of deep and somewhat obsessive interests, particularly in the fields of alchemy and art, and he had assembled around him a collection of practitioners and theorists whose work ranged from the genuinely empirical to the frankly mystical. Alchemists worked in laboratories within the castle precincts, seeking the transformation of base metals into gold or the discovery of the philosopher's stone, while painters and sculptors filled the imperial collections with works of extraordinary beauty and strangeness. Rudolf was known to spend long hours in contemplation of his Kunstkammer, that cabinet of curiosities containing natural specimens and artistic marvels and objects of obscure significance, and he often seemed more comfortable in the company of these silent wonders than in the presence of the diplomats and officials who sought his attention. For Tycho, this meant that direct contact with his imperial patron was relatively rare. Rudolf, despite his genuine interest in astronomical matters and his willingness to fund Tycho's work, was not a man who engaged frequently in personal meetings with those he supported. The emperor's temperament was withdrawn, perhaps melancholic, and he preferred to exercise his patronage at a distance, providing resources and protection while leaving the details of scientific work to those he had appointed. This arrangement suited Tycho well enough, for it allowed him considerable freedom in the conduct of his research, though it also meant that he could not always rely upon the immediate intervention of the emperor in matters that required swift resolution or additional support. The intellectual atmosphere of Prague in these years was one of considerable ferment, with scholars from across Europe converging upon the city to take advantage of Rudolf's patronage and the relative tolerance that characterized his court. Mathematicians and astronomers, physicians and natural philosophers, artists and engineers all found a place within this community, exchanging ideas and sometimes engaging in disputes that reflected the broader controversies of the age. For Tycho, who had spent so many years on his island observatory, relatively isolated from the currents of European intellectual life, this environment must have been both stimulating and occasionally exhausting, offering opportunities for collaboration and debate that had not been available to him in the quiet of Venn. It was in this setting, in February of the year 1600, that Tycho made one of the most consequential decisions of his final years, hiring as his assistant a young German mathematician named Johannes Kepler. Kepler had come to Prague seeking opportunity and refuge, for his position in the city of Graz had become untenable due to the religious conflicts that were then troubling the Habsburg lands, and he had heard of Tycho's presence at the imperial court and hoped to find employment in the service of the famous astronomer. The meeting between these two men, one at the end of his career and the other at the beginning of his, was not an easy one, for their temperaments were quite different and their approaches to the problems of astronomy did not always align. Tycho was by nature cautious, methodical, deeply committed to the primacy of observation over theoretical speculation. His great contribution to astronomy had been the accumulation of observational data of unprecedented accuracy, gathered over decades of patient work with instruments of his own design, and he believed firmly that any theory of planetary motion must be grounded in this observational foundation. Observe first, verize later, was the principle that guided his work, and he was suspicious of those who constructed elaborate theoretical systems without the empirical basis that he considered essential. Kepler, by contrast, was a man of powerful theoretical imagination, drawn to the search for underlying mathematical harmonies in the structure of the cosmos, and he was eager to use Tycho's observations to test and refine his own ideas about the nature of planetary orbits. The relationship between the two men was, as might be expected, contentious at times. Tycho was protective of his observational data, reluctant to share it freely even with his own assistant, and Kepler found this secrecy frustrating, for he needed access to the precise measurements that only Tycho possessed. There were disagreements about methods and priorities, about the allocation of tasks and the direction of research, and the younger man sometimes chafed under the authority of his employer. Yet despite these tensions, the collaboration was genuinely productive, for Tycho recognized Kepler's exceptional mathematical abilities and assigned him to work on the problem that would eventually become his greatest achievement, the analysis of the motion of Mars. The observations of Mars that Tycho had accumulated over the years presented particular difficulties for any theory of planetary motion, for the red planet's path across the sky did not conform neatly to the circular orbits that astronomers had traditionally assumed. Tycho set Kepler to work on this problem, providing him with the observational data necessary to attempt a solution, and though Tycho himself would not live to see the result, it was from this assignment that Kepler would eventually derive his laws of planetary motion, demonstrating that the orbit of Mars, and by extension the orbits of all the planets, were elliptical rather than circular. This discovery, which would transform the science of astronomy and provide the foundation for later work by Newton and others, was thus the direct product of the collaboration between these two very different men, the patient observer and the bold theorist, working together in the final years of Tycho's life. Tycho's household in Prague included not only Kepler but also members of his own family who assisted in the work of the observatory. His son, known as Tycho the Younger, contributed to the ongoing observations and calculations, while his son-in-law Franz Technogel also played a role in the management of Tycho's scientific affairs. These family members provided continuity and support for Tycho's projects, though their abilities were not equal to those of Kepler, and there would later be some tension over the control of Tycho's observational data after his death. The great project that occupied Tycho during these final years was the completion of his star catalogue and the planetary tables that would allow astronomers to predict the positions of the planets with greater accuracy than had ever before been possible. This work, which Tycho had begun during his years on Fen and had continued through all the disruptions of his exile, represented the culmination of his life's effort, the practical application of all those decades of careful observation. The tables, which would eventually be completed by Kepler after Tycho's death and published under the name Rudolphine Tables in honor of their imperial patron, would remain the standard reference for astronomical calculation for many years, a testament to the value of Tycho's observational method and the importance of the data he had so painstakingly gathered. Yet Tycho's time in Prague was not without its troubles, for there were those who had wronged him in the past and whose actions still rankled. Among these was Nicolaus Reimers Barr, known by his Latin name Ursus, a mathematician who had visited Tycho on Hven some years earlier and who had subsequently published a planetary system remarkably similar to the one Tycho himself had developed. Tycho believed, with considerable justification, that Ursus had plagiarized the Tychonic system, stealing the ideas that Tycho had shared with him during his visit and presenting them as his own invention. The dispute between the two men had grown bitter over the years, with Ursus publishing attacks on Tycho's character and Tycho seeking legal redress for what he considered theft of his intellectual property. Ursus had, as it happened, held the position of imperial mathematician before Tycho's arrival in Prague, and though he had died shortly before Tycho took up the post, the memory of his plagiarism remained a source of grievance. Kepler, before his association with Tycho, had actually corresponded with Ursus and had written words in praise of his work that Ursus had then published without permission, a circumstance that caused some awkwardness when Kepler entered Tycho's service. The matter was eventually smoothed over, but it illustrated the tangled relationships and rivalries that characterized the astronomical community of the period, a world in which priority of discovery was fiercely contested and accusations of theft were not uncommon. In the quiet of the Prague evenings, as Tycho continued his observations of the stars and planets, recording their positions with the care that had always distinguished his work, he must have reflected upon the strange path that had brought him to this place, so far from the island where he had spent his most productive years. The castle of Uraniborg was gone now, or soon would be, demolished by those who had no use for its instruments and no understanding of its purpose, and the great mural quadrant and the sextants and the amillary spheres existed only in memory and in the pages of the books that Tycho had published. Yet the work itself endured, preserved in the records that Tycho had kept and in the minds of those who had learned from him, and it would continue to bear fruit long after the astronomer himself had passed from the scene. In the autumn of the year 1601, the city of Prague was settling into its familiar rhythm of cool mornings and amber afternoons, the kind of weather that invites one to linger indoors, perhaps near a fire, perhaps with a warm drink and good company. Tycho Brahe had been living in this city for nearly 2 years by then, working steadily in his role as imperial mathematician to Rudolf II, cataloguing his decades of celestial observations and collaborating, sometimes contentiously, with his young assistant Johannes Kepler. He was 54 years old, which was considered a respectable age in that era, though certainly not ancient, and he remained vigorous in his work, still passionate about the stars, still convinced that his observations would reshape humanity's understanding of the heavens. There was no particular reason to think that October would bring anything other than the usual routine of measurements, calculations, and the slow, careful work of organizing a lifetime of data into a form that others might use. On the 13th of October, Tycho attended a banquet at the home of Peter Vock of Rosenberg, a wealthy Bohemian nobleman who was known for hosting elaborate gatherings where the guests might discuss philosophy, politics, art, and the natural sciences over many courses of food and generous pourings of wine. Such banquets were common among the educated elite of Prague, and Tycho, with his noble bearing and his famous reputation, was a welcome guest at these affairs. The evening proceeded as such evenings typically did, with conversation flowing as freely as the drink, and the hours passing in that pleasant haze that descends upon a well-fed and well-entertained gathering. According to the account later provided by Kepler, something rather unfortunate occurred during this banquet, something that would seem almost trivially embarrassing were it not for the serious consequences that followed. It appears that as the evening wore on, Tycho found himself in need of relieving his bladder, a perfectly natural requirement after several hours of eating and drinking. However, the customs of the time held that it was quite rude to leave the table before one's host had risen, and Tycho, ever conscious of etiquette and social propriety despite his sometimes eccentric personal habits, chose to remain seated rather than excuse himself. He waited, and he continued to wait, and the banquet continued, and the pressure in his bladder grew increasingly uncomfortable, but still he did not rise. Whether this was purely a matter of manners, or whether there was some deeper stubbornness in his character that prevented him from acknowledging a physical need in public, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that by the time the banquet finally concluded and Tycho was able to seek relief, something had gone wrong within his body. Some damage had been done that would not easily be undone. In the days that followed, Tycho developed what his contemporaries described as a bladder ailment, a condition that caused him considerable pain and difficulty in urinating. He took to his bed, and physicians were summoned, and various remedies of the era were attempted, though none proved effective. The condition worsened steadily, and Tycho found himself trapped in a cycle of suffering that must have been deeply distressing for a man so accustomed to control and precision in all aspects of his life. For 11 days he lay in agony, his body failing him in ways that no amount of astronomical knowledge could address, no careful observation could remedy. At times he grew delirious, his mind wandering to places that those attending him could not follow, perhaps to the stars he had watched so carefully, perhaps to the island of Fen where he had spent his most productive years, perhaps to memories of his childhood in Denmark or his years of wandering through the universities of Europe. During his final lucid moments, Tycho is reported to have spoken with Kepler, who had come to his bedside to attend his mentor and colleague in these difficult hours. The exact words that passed between them have been recorded in various ways by various historians, but the essence of what Tycho said has come down to us with reasonable clarity. He asked Kepler not to let his life appear to have been lived in vain. He wanted assurance that his decades of painstaking observation, his thousands upon thousands of careful measurements, his catalogues of stellar positions and planetary movements, would not simply gather dust in some archive, forgotten by future generations. He wanted to know that his work would continue, that someone would take his data and use it to answer the great questions about the nature of the cosmos that had driven him throughout his life. It was the plea of a man who had devoted everything to a single grand purpose and who, facing his own mortality, needed to believe that his purpose would outlast him. On the 24th of October, 1601, Tycho Brahe died. He was laid to rest with full honors befitting his status as imperial mathematician and his reputation as the greatest observational astronomer of his age. His funeral was held at the Church of Our Lady before Tycho, a magnificent Gothic structure that still stands in the old town square of Prague, its twin spires rising into the sky that Tycho had studied with such devotion. The burial ceremony was attended by dignitaries and scholars, and Tycho was interred in a manner that reflected the esteem in which he was held by the court and by the broader community of learned men who recognized his contributions to natural philosophy. A monument was erected to his memory, and for many years afterward, visitors to the church could pay their respects to the man who had measured the heavens with unprecedented accuracy. But the true measure of Tycho's legacy would not be found in monuments or ceremonies. It would be found in the thick volumes of observational data that he left behind, the careful records of planetary positions and stellar coordinates that represented the accumulated work of decades. Kepler, honoring the plea of his dying colleague, took possession of this data, and he began the long process of analyzing it, searching for the mathematical patterns that would explain the movements of the planets. He focused particularly on Mars, that rust-colored wanderer whose path through the sky had puzzled astronomers for centuries, and he worked through calculation after calculation, trying to fit the observations to various theoretical models. The task took years, and Kepler filled page after page with computations, many of them leading to dead ends, many of them requiring him to abandon cherished assumptions and start again from different premises. What Kepler eventually discovered, using Tycho's observations as his foundation, would transform astronomy in ways that Tycho himself had never imagined. The traditional assumption, dating back to the ancient Greeks, had been that celestial bodies moved in circles, because the circle was considered the most perfect geometric form, and the heavens were assumed to be a realm of perfection. Even Copernicus, in his heliocentric model, had retained circular orbits, simply relocating the center of those circles from the Earth to the Sun. But when Kepler attempted to fit circular orbits to Tycho's observations of Mars, he found that he could not make the numbers work. The discrepancies were small, just 8 minutes of arc, but Tycho's data was precise enough that Kepler could trust those small discrepancies. They were not errors in observation. They were telling him something important about the true shape of planetary orbits. After years of struggle, Kepler arrived at a conclusion that would have seemed almost heretical to earlier generations of astronomers. The planets do not move in circles. They move in ellipses, with the Sun located at one focus of the ellipse rather than at the center. This insight, which came to be known as Kepler's first law of planetary motion, was made possible only because Tycho's observations were accurate enough to reveal the subtle deviation from circular motion. Had the data been less precise, had it been gathered with the instruments of an earlier era, the elliptical nature of orbits might have remained hidden for decades or even centuries longer. But Tycho had built his instruments with such care, had developed his techniques of observation with such rigor, had repeated his measurements with such dedication, that his data could bear the weight of Kepler's analysis and reveal a truth that no one had previously suspected. Kepler went on to formulate 2 additional laws of planetary motion, describing how planets speed up as they approach the Sun and slow down as they move away, and establishing a precise mathematical relationship between a planet's orbital period and its average distance from the Sun. These 3 laws, taken together, provided a complete and accurate description of how planets move through space, a description that replaced the cumbersome and inaccurate systems of epicycles and deference that had burdened astronomy since ancient times. And all 3 laws were derived from the observational foundation that Tycho had provided, the meticulous measurements that represented the work of a lifetime. In 1627, more than a quarter century after Tycho's death, Kepler published the Rudolphine tables, a comprehensive set of astronomical tables that allowed astronomers to calculate the positions of the planets with greater accuracy than had ever before been possible. The tables were named in honor of Emperor Rudolf II, who had patronized both Tycho and Kepler, and they represented the ultimate fulfillment of the project that Tycho had begun decades earlier. Using these tables, astronomers could predict planetary positions, plan observations, and navigate by the stars with a precision that would have astonished earlier generations. The Rudolphine tables remained the standard reference for astronomical calculation for more than a century, a testament to the quality of the observations upon which they were based. The story of Tycho's death has occasionally been clouded by speculation and rumor, including theories that he might have been poisoned, perhaps by rivals who coveted his data, perhaps by Kepler himself who stood to gain so much from his mentor's death. These theories gained some traction because small amounts of mercury were detected in samples of Tycho's hair during an exhumation in 1901, and mercury poisoning was known to cause the kinds of symptoms that Tycho displayed in his final days. However, more thorough investigations, including a comprehensive exhumation and analysis conducted in 2010 using modern forensic techniques, found no evidence to support the poisoning hypothesis. The levels of mercury in Tycho's remains were not high enough to have caused his death, and the pattern of exposure was consistent with the medical and alchemical practices of his era rather than with deliberate poisoning. The most likely cause of his death remains what it always seemed to be: a severe urinary tract infection or bladder rupture that led to uremia, a toxic buildup of waste products in the blood that occurs when the kidneys fail to function properly. It was a painful and undignified end for a great man, but it was almost certainly a natural one, brought on by his own stubbornness at a dinner party rather than by any malicious act. Tycho's scientific legacy extended far beyond the work of Kepler, important as that was. The laws of planetary motion that Kepler derived from Tycho's data would later provide the essential foundation for Isaac Newton's theory of universal gravitation, the grand synthesis that explained not only how planets move but why they move as they do. Newton famously acknowledged his debt to those who came before him, and while Kepler is often mentioned as one of the giants upon whose shoulders Newton stood, it is worth remembering that Kepler himself stood upon the shoulders of Tycho. The chain of scientific progress that led from careful observation of the night sky to a comprehensive theory of gravity and motion depended at a crucial point on the existence of reliable, precise data, and that data was Tycho's gift to posterity. In a broader sense, Tycho's contribution to science was methodological as much as it was substantive. He demonstrated that progress in understanding the natural world required more than clever theories and elegant mathematics. It required patient, systematic observation conducted with the best instruments available, repeated many times to minimize error, recorded with scrupulous honesty, and made available to other researchers who might see patterns that the original observer had missed. This emphasis on empirical rigor, on letting the data speak rather than forcing it to conform to preconceived ideas, became one of the defining characteristics of modern science, and Tycho was one of its earliest and most influential practitioners. Today, Tycho is commemorated in various ways, including a prominent crater on the Moon that bears his name. The Tycho crater is one of the most visually striking features on the lunar surface, a relatively young impact site surrounded by a brilliant system of rays that extend outward for hundreds of kilometers, visible even with modest telescopes from Earth. It seems fitting that a man who spent his life observing celestial bodies should be remembered by a feature on our closest celestial neighbor, a permanent marker on a world that never knew clouds or atmospheric distortion, a world where the seeing conditions that Tycho struggled against on Earth simply do not exist. His tomb in Prague still receives visitors, curious travelers, and history enthusiasts who come to pay their respects to the astronomer with the golden nose, the nobleman who built a castle for the stars, the careful observer whose data changed our understanding of the cosmos. And somewhere in the archives of scientific history, preserved in libraries and museums and digital repositories around the world, his observations endure, still available to anyone who wishes to study them, still bearing witness to the precision and dedication that made them possible. Tycho Brahe asked not to have lived in vain, and in this, at least, his wish was granted many times over.